The wind off Black Ridge carried the smell of coming snow, and Raina Mercer hated it. Not because winter was coming. Winter always came to Montana Territory, brutal and indifferent, but because that particular smell reminded her of the last time she'd seen Thomas alive. 4 years ago this November. 4 years since he'd ridden out to check the north fence line during the first blizzard of the season and never came back. They found his horse 3 days later, frozen solid near Widow's Creek. They never found Thomas. The town of Red Fork assumed she'd sell. The bank gave her 60 days before foreclosure. The neighboring ranchers, men who'd shared whiskey with Thomas and called him brother, waited like vultures for the auction. But Raina didn't sell. She fired the ranch hands she couldn't pay, sold every piece of furniture that wasn't nailed down, and spent that first winter learning to survive on spite and stubbornness. She learned to splint fence posts in sub-zero darkness, to deliver breech calves with frozen fingers, to shoot coyotes at 300 yards because she couldn't afford to lose a single head of cattle. Iron Hollow Ranch survived that winter. Barely. The second winter, she hired 2 drifters willing to work for room and board. One stole her last good horse and disappeared. The other tried to force himself on her in the barn and left with a bullet wound in his thigh and a warning that the next one would go through his skull. The third winter, she worked alone. By the fourth winter, this winter, Raina Mercer had become something the valley didn't quite know how to categorize. Not a widow waiting for rescue. Not a woman willing to remarry for protection. Something harder. Something that made men uncomfortable when she walked into the general store or sat in church. Something that made Gideon Voss think she was weak enough to break. He was wrong. Gideon Voss didn't look like a monster. That was the first thing people noticed. He was tall but not imposing, well-dressed but not ostentatious, soft-spoken but not weak. He wore expensive suits ordered from Chicago, kept his graying hair neatly trimmed, and smiled like a gentleman when he bought you a drink. Right before he destroyed your life, Voss owned the largest cattle operation in Montana Territory, the Triple V Syndicate, stretching from the Yellowstone River to the Canadian border. 50,000 head of cattle, 200 hired men, enough political connections in Helena to make sheriffs disappear and judges rule in his favor regardless of evidence. But ownership wasn't enough for Gideon Voss. He wanted empire. Over the past decade, he'd systematically absorbed every major ranch in the territory through a rotating combination of legal pressure, financial manipulation, and violence carefully calibrated to stay just below federal attention. Families who refused to sell found their water sources mysteriously poisoned, their cattle rustled, their barns burning in the night. And if that didn't work, they disappeared. The territorial government knew. Everyone knew. But knowing and proving were different things, and the few men brave enough to testify against Voss had a way of changing their minds, or vanishing entirely, before trial. Red Fork had 3 sheriffs in the last 6 years. The current one, a spineless drunk named Mallory, spent most of his time in the Triple V's back pocket, and the rest pretending he didn't see what was happening. Iron Hollow Ranch was the last major holdout in the valley, and Voss had decided that tonight, November 14th, 1887, was the night it finally fell. Raina was mending fence wire when she saw the dust. It was late afternoon, the sun already bleeding red behind the Rockies, temperature dropping fast. She'd been working since dawn, replacing rotted posts along the eastern pasture, brutal work that left her hands raw and her back screaming. But the fence had to hold. Everything had to hold. She straightened slowly, one hand pressed to her lower back, and stared at the thin brown line rising from Black Ridge. At first she thought it was a dust devil, common enough in autumn when the ground was dry and the wind came hard from the mountains. Then she saw the riders. 1, 2, 5, 10. More. They moved in formation, too organized to be drifters, too many to be neighbors. The sun glinted off metal, rifle barrels probably, though the distance made it hard to tell. Raina's stomach went cold. She dropped the fence wire and ran. Iron Hollow's main house was a quarter-mile from the eastern pasture, a 2-story structure Thomas had built with timber from their own land and pride that had nearly bankrupted them. It wasn't fancy, rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, windows that rattled in strong wind, but it was solid. It would have to be. Raina hit the porch at a dead run, slammed through the front door, and went straight for the rifle rack Thomas had mounted above the fireplace. She grabbed the Winchester first, her favorite, the one she'd used to kill a grizzly 2 summers ago, and checked the load. 6 rounds. Not enough. She crossed to the kitchen, yanked open the cabinet beneath the sink, and pulled out the ammunition box hidden behind a false panel. Thomas had been paranoid about raids, about rustlers, about the day when words wouldn't be enough. Turned out he'd been right. Raina stuffed her pockets with cartridges, grabbed a second rifle, an older Henry repeater with a loose stock, and moved to the window. The riders were closer now. She counted 16. 16 armed men riding toward her ranch in formation, and she was alone with 2 rifles and maybe 40 rounds of ammunition total. The math wasn't good. Her hands started to shake, and she forced them still. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She'd survived 4 winters through calculation and will, and she'd survived this the same way. Think. The house was defensible. Thick walls, limited entry points, good sight lines from the second floor. But she couldn't hold it alone, not against 16 men who could surround her and wait her out, or simply burn the whole structure down. The barn was bigger, but less secure. The root cellar might buy her time, but time for what? There was no cavalry coming, no neighbors who'd risk their own necks. The nearest federal marshal was 3 days' ride, assuming he'd even respond to a telegram from a woman everyone assumed was already beaten. Raina was still calculating impossible odds when she heard the horse. One rider, coming fast from the west. Raina swung the Winchester toward the sound, finger on the trigger, every muscle tight. The horse appeared first, a gray gelding, lean and tired-looking. Then the rider, a man in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that looked like it had lost arguments with hard living and worse luck. He wore a dusty coat that had seen better decades, a hat pulled low, and carried a rifle across his saddle with the casual comfort of someone who'd used it often. But it was his eyes that made Raina hesitate. Dead eyes. Soldier's eyes. The kind that had seen things that didn't leave. He reined up 20 feet from the porch, hands visible, no sudden movements. "Ma'am?" His voice was rough, Western, with an accent she couldn't quite place. "You've got company coming from the East Ridge. 16 riders, heavily armed, moving with purpose." "I know," Raina said, rifle still leveled. "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Cade Ashford." He nodded toward Black Ridge. "And you've got maybe 15 minutes before your world changes." "You with them?" "No, ma'am." "Then why are you here?" Something that might have been a smile crossed his scarred face. "Wrong place, wrong time. Story of my life." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." They stared at each other for 5 long seconds, Raina trying to decide if he was a threat, Cade waiting with the patience of someone used to being judged. Finally, Raina said, "You planning to help, or you just here to watch?" "Depends." Cade's eyes flicked to the ridge, then back to her. "Those riders, they triple Vi men?" "Probably." "Voss himself?" "If I'm lucky." Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he dismounted slowly, tied his horse to the porch rail, and pulled a saddlebag from the gray's flank. When he opened it, Raina saw ammunition. A lot of it. "You know how to use that Winchester?" Cade asked. "Better than you'd think." "Good." He moved past her onto the porch, stopped at the door. "Because I've fought with worse odds in worse places, and we're about to make tonight very expensive for whoever's riding toward us." Raina lowered the rifle. Not much, just enough to not be pointing at his chest. "Why?" she asked. "Why help a stranger?" Cade looked at her for a long moment, and something old and tired moved behind those dead eyes. "Because 16 men riding armed toward a lone woman's ranch means something bad is about to happen," he said quietly, "and I'm tired of watching bad things happen." Before Raina could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Time was up. Cade moved through the house like he'd been there before, checking windows, marking angles, calculating fields of fire with the mechanical precision of someone who'd defended worse positions. "Barn's got good cover," he said, peering through the kitchen window. "But they'll burn it first chance they get. Same with the stable. House is stone and timber, harder to torch, but they can wait us out." "They won't wait," Raina said. "Voss doesn't have the patience." "You know him?" "Everyone knows him," Cade nodded. "Then he's here to make a point, not negotiate. That's good." "How is that good?" "Because men making points get sloppy." He turned from the window. "You got more ammunition than what's in your pockets?" Raina hesitated. The cash beneath the barn had been Thomas's secret, his insurance policy against the day when civilization finally failed. She'd kept it hidden for 4 years, never told anyone, not even during the winters when selling those guns might have saved the ranch. But tonight, secrets were a luxury she couldn't afford. Follow me. She led Cade out the back door, across the yard to the barn. The temperature had dropped hard. Her breath misted in the twilight, and the first stars were starting to show. The riders from the ridge weren't visible yet, but she could feel them coming, a pressure in the air like the wait before lightning. Inside the barn, Raina moved to the third stall from the door, knelt, and pried up 3 specific floorboards with her fingers. Beneath them was a void space Thomas had carved into the foundation, 6 feet long, 3 feet deep, invisible unless you knew where to look. And inside that space, weapons. Cade let out a low whistle. 2 more rifles, including a Sharps .50 caliber buffalo gun that could drop a man at 1,000 yards. 4 revolvers. A shotgun with a barrel sawed short enough to be illegal in most territories, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. Your husband prepared, Cade said. Thomas believed in insurance. Smart man. Dead man, Raina corrected. She started loading cartridges into a canvas bag. Didn't do him much good when the blizzard came. Cade didn't respond to that. He lifted the Sharps, checked the action, nodded with approval. This changes things, he said. We've got firepower. Now we need strategy. He looked at her. You any good with that buffalo gun? I've used it. That's not what I asked. Raina met his eyes. I killed a grizzly with it at 400 yards while it was charging my cattle. Does that answer your question? For the first time, Cade smiled. A real smile. Not the ghost of one. Yes, ma'am, it does. They hauled the weapons back to the house in silence, moving fast as the last light bled from the sky. Raina's heart was hammering, but her hand stayed steady. She'd been afraid before. Every winter brought new fears, new impossible odds, but she'd learned to function through it. Fear was just another kind of cold. You kept moving or you froze. Inside, they set up positions. Raina upstairs with the Sharps and the Winchester, commanding the high ground and long approaches. Cade downstairs with the repeater and the shotgun, covering the close angles in the door. When they come, Cade said, loading the Henry, let me talk first. Sometimes men like Voss want theater before violence. If we're lucky, we buy a few minutes. And if we're not lucky, then we make them regret riding out here. Raina checked the Sharps one more time, settling the stock against her shoulder, feeling the weight. 4 years ago, she'd been a rancher's wife who could barely shoot straight. Now she was a woman who'd learned to kill anything that threatened her survival. Cade, she said quietly. Yeah? Thank you. He looked up from the rifle, and something unreadable crossed his face. Ask me again when we're still breathing tomorrow, he said. Then they heard the horses. The 16 riders came to a stop 50 yards from the house, spread in a loose semicircle that covered every angle of approach. They were professional, no bunching, no silhouettes against the skyline, weapons held ready but not raised. These weren't cowboys or drifters. They were hired guns. At the center of the formation, mounted on a black stallion that probably cost more than Raina's entire herd, sat Gideon Voss. Even in the darkness, he looked exactly like the stories described. Distinguished, almost elegant, the kind of man who could order a killing over breakfast and attend church that same Sunday without a flicker of conscience. Mrs. Mercer, his voice carried easily across the distance, cultured and calm. I apologize for the late hour. Might we have a word? Raina stood on the porch, the Winchester cradled in her arms, very visible. Behind her, in the doorway's shadow, Cade waited with the repeater. You bring 15 men to have a word? Raina called back. These are dangerous times, Voss said pleasantly. A man can't be too careful. Neither can a woman. That earned her a smile she could hear in his voice. Indeed, your resilience is admirable, Mrs. Mercer. 4 years alone on this ranch, most women would have broken. Most men, too, if we're being honest. I'm not interested in flattery, Mr. Voss. State your business. Very well. Voss shifted in his saddle. I'm here to make you an offer, a generous one. I'll purchase Iron Hollow for $20,000. Cash, paid tomorrow if you sign tonight. That's triple what this property's worth, and we both know it. $20,000. It was a fortune. Enough to start over anywhere in the country, enough to never worry about frozen cattle or failed crops or brutal winters again. It was also a lie. And if I refuse, Raina asked, then I'll be forced to pursue other avenues. Voss's tone never changed, still pleasant, still reasonable. You see, Mrs. Mercer, I've recently acquired documentation suggesting your late husband's claim to this land was irregular, built on a survey error, as it turns out. The territorial government is reviewing the matter, but I'm confident the courts will rule in my favor. That's horseshit, Raina said flatly. Thomas filed that claim legally in 1881. We have the deed. Papers can be challenged. Courts can be convinced. Voss spread his hands. Why endure that ugliness when we can resolve this pleasantly? Take the money. Start fresh. Everyone wins. Raina was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, If you want this land, you'll have to bury me in it. The silence that followed was absolute. Voss's pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold moved through his voice. I was afraid you'd say that. He sighed. You understand, of course, that your continued occupation of this property, illegal property, I might add, puts you in a difficult position. If something unfortunate were to happen tonight, well, accidents occur, especially to isolated women in disputed territory. That a threat? Merely an observation. Raina raised the Winchester, sighted down the barrel, and put Voss's head in her crosshairs. Here's my observation, she said. You've got 3 seconds to turn those horses around before I paint this valley with your brains. For the first time, Voss's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough to show genuine surprise. You'd murder me in cold blood? Self-defense, Raina corrected. 16 armed men on my property after dark, threatening a lone woman. Any jury in Montana would call that justified. There won't be a jury, Voss said quietly. There'll just be a burned house and a dead woman that nobody mourns. He raised his hand, and Raina pulled the trigger. The Winchester's crack split the night like a whip. Raina didn't aim for Voss. Not that first shot. She put the round 2 inches above his head, close enough that he felt the bullet's passage, far enough that it couldn't be called murder. A warning. The black stallion reared, nearly throwing Voss from the saddle. The men behind him scattered, horses wheeling, rifles coming up. And then Cade fired. The Henry's deeper boom echoed from the house, and one of the riders, a scarred man with a bandolier across his chest, jerked backward as his hat flew off his head. He hit the ground hard, clutching his skull, screaming. Cade had creased him, intentionally. A 1/4 inch deeper, and the man would be dead. Another warning. Next one, Cade called from the doorway, his voice carrying clearly. Go center mass, your call, Voss. The riders had control of their horses now, rifles raised, but nobody fired. They were professionals, waiting for orders. And Voss was staring at the house with an expression that had gone from pleasant to something much darker. You're making a mistake, he said. Been making them my whole life, Raina replied. What's one more? Voss studied her for a long moment, calculating, reassessing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The lone widow was supposed to be terrified, desperate, willing to take any escape offered. Instead, she'd put a bullet past his head and shown him a house with at least 2 armed defenders who could shoot. The equation had changed. Stand down, Voss said quietly to his men. Then, louder. Mrs. Mercer, you've made your position clear. We'll discuss this matter through proper legal channels. You do that, but understand something. His voice went cold. This valley belongs to me. Every acre, every river, every soul that works this land. You're the last holdout, the last woman foolish enough to believe she can stand against progress. And I promise you, whether it takes a week or a month or a year, Iron Hollow will be mine. Then you better bring more men, Raina said. Voss smiled, not pleasant anymore, but predatory. I will. He wheeled his horse and rode back toward the ridge, his men following in formation. Within minutes, they were dust and darkness, disappearing into the Montana night. Raina lowered the Winchester. Her hands were shaking now. Delayed reaction, adrenaline crash, the reality of what she'd just done finally hitting. She'd drawn a line in blood and dared the most dangerous man in the territory to cross it. There was no going back from this. You all right? Cade asked from behind her. No, Raina said honestly. But I will be. She turned to face him. In the darkness, his scarred face looked ancient, carved from stone in hard years. "He'll come back," she said. "I know. With more men, more guns. He'll burn everything I've built." "Probably." "And you'll still help me?" Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he set the Henry against the door frame and met her eyes. "I've spent 20 years drifting from one failed cause to another," he said softly. "Fighting in wars that didn't matter, defending ground that got swallowed anyway, watching good people lose because bad people had more money and fewer morals. And I'm tired, Mrs. Mercer. Tired of walking away. Tired of pretending that running makes things better." He looked out at the valley, at the darkness where Voss had disappeared. "So yeah," he said, "I'll help you. Not because I think we'll win, but because for once in my worthless life I want to stand for something that matters." Raina felt something crack in her chest, the armor she'd built over 4 brutal winters, the hardness that had kept her alive but alone. "Thank you," she whispered. Cade just nodded. They stood there in silence, 2 damaged people facing impossible odds, while the Montana wind carried the promise of snow and the certainty of violence to come. Somewhere in the darkness, Gideon Voss was planning his next move. But inside Iron Hollow Ranch, Raina Mercer was done running. And that changed everything. They spent the next 2 hours fortifying the house. Cade worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, stacking flour sacks against the downstairs windows as improvised barriers, filling buckets with water in case of fire, marking fields of fire with chalk on the floorboards. "You've defended a lot of houses," Raina observed, watching him wedge a timber brace against the back door. "A few." "Where?" He didn't answer immediately, just tested the brace's strength and moved to the next window. "Kansas during the border wars," he said finally. "Texas, when the Comanche were pushing back against settlers. Arizona Territory, back when Apache raiders could hit 3 ranches in one night and disappear like smoke." He paused. "And during the war?" "Both sides, at different times." Raina frowned. "Both sides?" "Wore gray for 2 years, wore blue for 6 months after that." Cade's voice was flat, emotionless. "Fought for causes I believed in until I realized neither side had a cause worth the bodies they stacked. Then I just fought to stay alive." "That where you got the scars?" "Some of them." He moved to the next window and Raina let the silence stretch. She'd known men like Cade before, soldiers who'd survived too much to ever really come home, who carried their wars in the lines around their eyes and the way they never sat with their back to a door. Thomas had been like that in the early years. He'd fought in the war too, seen things he refused to talk about. It took him 5 years to stop waking up screaming, 10 years to trust that peace might actually last. He never made it to 15. "The blizzard that took your husband," Cade said suddenly. "That wasn't weather, was it?" Raina stopped loading cartridges. "What makes you say that?" "Because Voss rides out here with 16 men and forged documents, expecting you to fold." Cade turned to face her. "Men don't bring that kind of force unless they've tried softer methods first. And the timing's convenient. Your husband disappears right when someone wants your land." "Thomas rode out during a storm," Raina said carefully. "The blizzard caught him between here and the north fence. His horse came back frozen. They never found his body." "They find the body of anyone else who died that storm?" "2 trappers, a prospector named Henley. And nothing. They were frozen solid, half buried in drifts." Cade studied her face in the lamplight. "But you never believed it," he said quietly. "Did you?" Raina's hands clenched around the cartridge she was holding. "I don't know what I believe," she said. "Thomas was smart, careful. He wouldn't have ridden into a storm that bad unless he was chasing something or running from it." "Did anyone investigate?" Sheriff Mallory asked a few questions, filed a report, called it an accident. Raina's voice went hard. "Then he started showing up at the ranch every few weeks, suggesting I sell before the next winter killed me too. Always helpful, always concerned. Always working for Voss. I can't prove that. Don't need proof to know the truth." Raina met his eyes, and something passed between them, a recognition, maybe, of shared damage and shared anger. "If Thomas was murdered," she said slowly, "and if Voss was behind it, then tonight was never about negotiation," Cade finished. "It was about eliminating the last loose end." The weight of that settled over the room like snow. "I should have sold," Raina whispered. 4 years ago, when the bank offered me pennies. I should have taken the money and disappeared. Instead, I stayed out of spite and stubbornness, and now, what? Now you're fighting for something that matters, Kate interrupted. That's not spite, that's survival. It's suicide. Maybe. He checked the loads in the repeater. But if you're going down, at least you're going down swinging. Raina laughed, a short, bitter sound. You're either very brave or very stupid, Mr. Ashford. Been called both. He moved to the window, peered out at the darkness, usually in the same sentence. They worked in silence after that, two strangers preparing for a war neither of them expected to survive. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, and somewhere in the darkness, Gideon Voss was gathering his forces. News of the standoff reached Red Fork before midnight. One of Voss's riders, the one Cade had creased, rode into town bleeding from a scalp wound and screaming about attempted murder. By the time the doctor finished stitching him up, half the town had heard some version of the story. Most didn't believe it. Raina Mercer, the quiet widow who'd barely survived 4 winters alone, pulling a gun on the most powerful man in Montana Territory? Impossible. But a few people, the ones who'd watched her survive when everyone expected her to break, heard the story and felt something shift. In the back room of the Red Fork Saloon, 3 ranchers named Keller, Hobbs, and Yates shared a bottle of whiskey and talked in low voices. She actually shot at him? Keller asked, a weathered man in his 50s who'd lost half his land to Voss's legal manipulations. Past him, the bartender corrected. He'd heard the story third hand from a ranch hand who'd heard it from Voss's wounded man. Warning shot, then the stranger with her put a bullet through Jackson's scalp. What stranger? Don't know, drifter maybe. But he can shoot. Hobbs, younger, angrier, still bitter about the barn fire that had bankrupted him 2 years ago, laughed without humor. Won't matter. Voss will ride back with 50 men and burn her out. Make an example. Maybe, Yates said quietly. He was the oldest of the 3, a man who'd survived the war and 3 range wars after that. But she stood up to him, first person in this valley with the stones to actually pull a trigger. And she'll die for it, Hobbs said. Probably. Yates took a drink. Question is, does she die alone? The 3 men looked at each other. None of them answered. Across town, in a boarding house that smelled of tobacco and old regret, Cade Ashford couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkness of Raina's guest room, a small space she'd offered when he'd refused to leave the ranch undefended, and cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time that hour. The weapon didn't need cleaning, but his hands needed something to do. He'd meant what he said on the porch. He was tired of running, tired of watching bad things happen because good people were too afraid or too beaten to stand up. But knowing you were tired of running and actually standing still were different things, because standing still meant dying. Cade had survived 20 years of violence through movement, never staying in one place long enough for the past to catch up, never forming attachments that could be used against him, never believing in anything hard enough that losing it would break him. Iron Hollow Ranch was all 3. It was a fixed position he couldn't leave without looking like a coward. Raina Mercer was an attachment he'd formed the moment he'd decided to help her. And the idea that one woman's refusal to surrender could actually matter, that was a belief dangerous enough to get him killed. But he was staying anyway, because if he walked away tonight, if he saddled his gray horse and rode south before Voss came back with real numbers, then everything he'd survived in his life meant nothing. All the battles he'd fought, all the ground he'd held, all the impossible odds he'd beaten, they were just delays, ways to postpone the inevitable, running from one doomed position to another until age or luck finally failed and he died anonymous and forgotten. But here, tonight, defending this ranch with this stubborn woman who refused to quit, maybe that meant something. Maybe that was worth dying for. Cade finished cleaning the rifle, loaded it, and set it against the wall within arm's reach. Then he lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl across the Montana darkness. Tomorrow, Voss would come. And tomorrow, Cade Ashford would stop running. Dawn came cold and clear. Raina woke before sunrise, old habit from 4 years of winter ranching, and found Cade already awake, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and his rifle across his knees. You sleep? She asked. Some. Liar. That earned her half a smile. She joined him on the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. The valley stretched before them, gold and pink in the early light, beautiful and indifferent. "You ever think about leaving?" Kate asked quietly. "Before last night, before things got complicated." "Every day," Raina admitted. "Every winter. Every time the cattle died, or the fences broke, or the loneliness got so heavy, I could barely breathe. But you stayed." "Yeah." "Why?" Raina was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunrise paint the mountains. "Because Thomas built this place," she said finally. "Not just the house, or the barn, but the idea of it. He believed we could make something here, something that belonged to us, that we'd earned with our own hands." She paused. "And when he died, everyone expected me to quit. The bank, the town, the neighbors, they all assumed I'd sell and disappear. Like I was just the wife, not a partner. Like 4 years of work meant nothing. So you stayed to prove them wrong, at first." Raina pulled the blanket tighter. "But then it became something else. It became about refusing to let bastards like Voss decide what I deserved, about being too stubborn to die quietly." Cade nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "That's a reason," he said. They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning frost. In the distance, cattle were moving toward the water tank, maybe 30 head, all that remained of the herd Thomas had built. Not enough to be profitable, barely enough to survive, but still there, still fighting. "Cade," Raina said softly. "Yeah?" "Last night, when you said you wanted to stand for something that matters, I meant it. I believe you." She turned to face him. "But I need you to understand something. Voss will come back, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but soon. And when he does, he won't offer money or waste time talking. He'll come with enough men to crush us, burn this place to ashes, and bury us where nobody will ever find the bodies." "I know." "And you're still staying?" Cade met her eyes. And in that moment, Raina saw past the scars and the hard years to the man beneath. Damaged, yes, but not broken. Tired, but not defeated. "I'm staying," he said simply. Raina felt something shift in her chest, the same crack from last night, widening. For 4 years she'd survived alone, trusted no one, needed no one. But maybe, just maybe, survival didn't have to mean isolation. "Then we better prepare," she said, standing. "Because when Voss comes, we're going to make him regret every step he takes toward this ranch." Cade rose beside her, and together they walked back into the house to begin planning a war they had almost no chance of winning. But sometimes, Raina thought, the fight mattered more than the victory. And sometimes, standing your ground was the only choice that let you sleep at night, even if it was the last night you'd ever see. The siege of Iron Hollow Ranch was about to begin. The telegram arrived in Helena 3 days after the standoff, carried by a messenger who'd ridden through 2 snowstorms to deliver it. Federal Marshal Wade Carrick read it twice, set it down on his desk, and poured himself a whiskey he didn't want but needed anyway. The message was brief. Gideon Voss moving against Iron Hollow Ranch. Widow Mercer refusing to sell. Situation escalating. Request federal intervention before bloodshed. It wasn't signed, which meant whoever sent it was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. In Montana Territory, crossing Voss was a good way to end up missing, and sending telegrams to federal authorities was about as subtle as shooting at him, which, according to the rumors filtering up from Red Fork, someone had already done. Carrick was 53 years old, had served as a federal marshal for 18 years, and had exactly 0 illusions about how territorial politics actually worked. The federal government had authority on paper. In practice, men like Voss owned enough judges, sheriffs, and politicians that federal authority meant whatever they decided it meant. He'd investigated Voss twice before, once for land fraud, once for suspected murder. Both times witnesses had disappeared or recanted. Both times the cases had collapsed before reaching trial. Both times Carrick had gone home knowing that justice was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. But this telegram was different, because if Raina Mercer had actually pulled a gun on Voss and lived to tell about it, that meant someone had finally called his bluff. And if Voss responded the way Carrick expected, with overwhelming force designed to break her publicly, then the whole valley would be watching to see if resistance was possible or fatal. This wasn't just about one ranch anymore. It was about whether fear or law governed Montana Territory. Carrick finished his whiskey, grabbed his coat, and went to find his deputies. If he rode hard, he could reach Red Fork in 4 days. Maybe 5 if the weather turned. The question was whether that would be fast enough. Back at Iron Hollow Ranch, Raina and Cade weren't waiting for federal help. They were preparing for war. Cade had insisted on scouting the perimeter at first light, riding a wide circuit around the property to identify approaches, cover positions, and potential ambush points. He returned 2 hours later with a face that told Raina everything she needed to know. "Well?" she asked, meeting him at the barn. "You've got 3 problems," Cade said, dismounting. "First, the eastern approach from Black Ridge is wide open. No natural cover, no choke points. If they come that way with numbers, we can't stop them, just slow them down. Second problem? The creek bed on the south side. It's dry this time of year, but it runs close enough to the house that a smart man could use it to get within 100 yards without being seen. Put a few shooters there, and they can pin us down while the main force hits from the front." Raina felt her stomach tighten. She'd known the ranch's defensive weaknesses. Thomas had pointed them out years ago, but hearing Cade confirm them made the danger real. "And the third problem?" she asked. Cade pulled off his hat, wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the cold. "The third problem is that Voss has probably already figured out everything I just told you," he said, "which means when he comes back, he'll hit us exactly where we're weakest. So what do? We cheat." Raina frowned. "How do you cheat in a siege?" "By not being where they expect us to be." Cade walked toward the house, gesturing for her to follow. "They'll expect us to defend the house because that's what makes sense. Thick walls, good sight lines, protection from fire. But if we're in the house when they surround us, we're trapped. So where do we defend from?" "Everywhere and nowhere." He stopped at the porch, turned to face her. "We turn this ranch into a nightmare. We set traps, create false positions, make them think we've got twice as many guns as we do. We fight mobile, hit them from the barn, fall back to the stable, shift to the water tower, keep them guessing, make every piece of ground cost them blood." Raina stared at him. "That's not defending, that's guerrilla warfare." "It's survival," Cade corrected. "Voss is bringing professional guns, men who fought range wars, Indian campaigns, maybe even the war itself. They know how to take defended positions because they do it for money. But guerrilla fighting, that's different. That requires commitment they don't have. They'll break before we do." "You sure about that?" "No," Cade admitted. "But it's our best chance." They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Cade showed Raina how to dig firing pits that could be abandoned quickly, how to cache ammunition in multiple locations, how to create false muzzle flashes using lanterns and mirrors that would draw fire away from their actual positions. It was brutal work, digging frozen ground, hauling supplies, calculating angles of fire, but Raina attacked it with the same grim determination that had kept her alive through 4 winters. Around noon, they took a break. Raina made coffee on the wood stove while Cade studied a hand-drawn map of the property he'd sketched that morning. "You learned all this in the war?" Raina asked, handing him a cup. "Some of it." Cade sipped the coffee, grimaced at the bitterness. "Most I learned afterward, fighting Comanche in Texas. They were masters at this kind of warfare. Hit hard, disappear, make every rock and shadow deadly. Killed more soldiers through fear and exhaustion than bullets." "And you fought them?" "For a while. Then I fought with them." He saw her expression and shrugged. "War makes strange allies. The enemy you respected sometimes becomes the teacher you need." Raina sat down across from him, warming her hands on her own cup. Outside, the wind was picking up again. Another storm coming, probably by nightfall. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Depends on the question. Why'd you really stop here?" Raina met his eyes. "You said wrong place, wrong time, but that's not the whole truth. A drifter who wanted to avoid trouble would have ridden past when he saw those men on the ridge. You rode toward it." Cade was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee like it held answers he'd been searching for. "I was heading south," he said finally. "Thought maybe I'd try California, see if starting over actually worked, or if it was just another lie men told themselves. But when I saw those riders moving on your ranch," he paused, "I've seen that formation before. Professional guns moving with purpose, and I knew what it meant." "So you decided to play hero?" "No." His voice was flat. "I decided to stop being a coward. The word hung between them like smoke. Cade, oh! I've walked away from 100 fights that weren't mine, he interrupted. Told myself it was smart, that survival meant not getting involved, that other people's wars weren't worth dying for. And maybe that was true. Maybe I lived longer because I kept moving. He looked up, and his eyes were older than his face. But living isn't the same as being alive. And somewhere in the last 20 years, I forgot the difference. Raina didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent 4 years surviving through isolation, convincing herself that needing nobody meant never being disappointed. But sitting across from this scarred stranger who'd chosen to fight for a woman he didn't know and a cause he had no stake in, maybe isolation was just another kind of dying. Well, she said quietly, I'm glad you stopped being a coward. Cade's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Ask me again when this is over. They went back to work after that, preparing defenses that probably wouldn't be enough, and strategies that depended on luck they probably didn't have. But they prepared anyway, because the alternative was surrender, and neither of them knew how to do that anymore. By late afternoon, word of the standoff had spread beyond Red Fork to the neighboring ranches and settlements. The story grew with each telling. Some versions had Raina shooting Voss in the shoulder, others claimed she'd killed 3 of his men. A few even suggested the stranger helping her was a famous gunfighter from Texas or Colorado. None of the stories were accurate, but all of them carried the same message. Someone had finally stood up to Gideon Voss and survived. In the small town of Copper Springs, 20 miles northwest of Iron Hollow, a rancher named Dutch Calloway heard the news from a traveling peddler and immediately rode to find his neighbors. Calloway was 48, built like a bull, with hands scarred from 30 years of ranch work. He'd lost his son to influenza 2 winters ago, lost half his land to Voss's legal manipulations the year after that, and had been drinking away what remained of his life ever since. But hearing about Raina Mercer pulling a gun on the man who'd destroyed him, something woke up inside Dutch Calloway that he thought had died with his boy. He found Carl Brennan and James Ortiz at the general store, loading supplies. Both men had been pushed off their original claims by the Triple V syndicate. Both had resettled on marginal land barely worth farming. Both had that hollow look of men who'd given up. You hear about the Mercer woman? Dutch asked. Brennan nodded, a thin man in his 30s with a permanent cough. Heard she's dead by now. Maybe, maybe not. Dutch leaned against the hitching post. But she stood up. That's more than any of us did. Standing up gets you killed, Ortiz said quietly. He was older, Mexican by birth, scarred from a range war down in New Mexico that had cost him everything. So does kneeling, Dutch replied. We've been kneeling for 3 years, letting Voss take whatever he wants. Our land, our water, our futures. And where's it gotten us? Still breathing, Brennan said. Are we? Dutch looked between them. Because I don't feel alive anymore. I feel like a ghost waiting for permission to disappear. Ortiz studied him carefully. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we ride to Iron Hollow, see if that woman's still standing. And if she is, if she's actually fighting back, maybe we help her. That's suicide, Brennan said. Maybe. Dutch straightened. But at least it's a choice. The 3 men stood in silence, each calculating different kinds of math. The cost of action versus inaction, the weight of fear versus shame, the question of whether dying for something was better than living for nothing. I'm in, Ortiz said finally. Brennan coughed, spat, looked at the ground. Hell, he muttered. I'm probably dead by spring anyway. Might as well make it count. By sunset, 5 more men had joined them. Ranchers and former ranch hands who'd been pushed out, beaten down, or simply forgotten. None of them were young, none of them were soldiers, but all of them had reached the point where fear had finally lost to anger. They would ride for Iron Hollow at dawn. Back at the ranch, Raina was discovering that preparing for war was easier than living with the waiting. She'd checked the ammunition 3 times, repositioned the rifles twice, walked the defensive perimeter until she'd memorized every firing angle. Now she sat on the porch in the growing darkness, a blanket around her shoulders, watching the first stars appear. Cade emerged from the barn carrying an armload of firewood. Storm's coming, he said, setting the wood by the door. Be here by midnight. Good, Raina said. He raised an eyebrow. How's a storm good? Makes it harder for them to move, harder to see, harder to coordinate an attack. She pulled the blanket tighter. Thomas always said the weather was the frontier's best defense. The land itself fights on your side if you respect it. Your husband sounds like he was smart. He was. Raina's voice softened. Stubborn, too. Wouldn't admit he was wrong, even when the evidence was staring him in the face. But smart. Cade sat down on the porch step, his back against the post. You think Voss killed him? He asked quietly. Raina had been avoiding that question for 3 days. Avoiding it for 4 years, really. Because admitting the possibility meant accepting that Thomas's death wasn't random tragedy, but deliberate murder. And if it was murder, then she'd spent 4 years grieving instead of getting justice. I think Thomas rode north that day to check something, she said slowly. He'd been worried about rustlers, about men moving through our land at night. He thought someone was scouting our defenses. She paused. The morning he left, he kissed me and said he'd be back by supper. He promised. And he never broke promises? Never. Cade nodded slowly, understanding what she wasn't saying. Men didn't break promises unless something broke them first. When this is over, he said, we'll find out what happened. When this is over, we'll probably be dead. Maybe. Cade looked up at the stars. But if we're not, if we somehow survive this mess, then we owe it to Thomas to get the truth, however ugly it is. Raina felt tears sting her eyes, and she blinked them back angrily. She'd cried enough over the past 4 years. Cried through 2 winters of loneliness, cried through cattle deaths and failed crops, cried through nights when the silence got so heavy she thought it would crush her. But she was done crying. Cade, she said. Yeah? If things go bad tomorrow, if Voss comes with too many men and we can't hold, I want you to run. Take the gray horse and ride hard. Don't try to be a hero. He turned to look at her and something like amusement crossed his scarred face. That's not how this works, he said. I'm serious. I chose this fight. You didn't. There's no shame in surviving. Raina. He stood, faced her directly. I've been running my whole life, from the war, from responsibility, from anything that might require me to actually stand for something. And I'm tired. Tired of moving. Tired of surviving without living. He paused. So no. If things go bad, I'm not running. I'm staying right here, fighting beside a stubborn woman who's too mean to quit. Despite everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the certainty of violence to come, Raina laughed. Too mean to quit, she repeated. That what I am? Among other things. Like what? Cade considered the question seriously. Brave, he said finally. Tougher than you should have to be. Smart enough to survive 4 winters alone. Stubborn enough to pull a gun on the most dangerous man in Montana. He met her eyes. And probably the only person in this valley who remembers what having principles actually costs. Raina felt her throat tighten. That's quite a list, she managed. It's the truth. They stood there in the darkness, 2 damaged people who'd found each other by accident and chosen each other by necessity. The wind was picking up now, carrying the smell of snow and pine. Storm's here, Cade said quietly. Yeah. You should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be hard. I know. But neither of them moved, because sleep meant surrendering control, and control was all they had left. Finally, Raina turned toward the door. Cade, she said over her shoulder. Yeah? Thank you for staying, for fighting, for... She struggled to find words. For reminding me I'm not alone. He nodded slowly, and in the lamplight from the house, his scars looked less like damage and more like a map of survival. You never were, he said. The storm hit an hour later, turning the world white and erasing the horizon. Snow fell thick and fast, coating the ranch in silence, burying the valley under inches of frozen certainty. And somewhere in that white darkness, Gideon Voss was gathering his forces for the attack he'd promised. But inside Iron Hollow Ranch, Raina Mercer slept with a rifle beside her bed, and the knowledge that tomorrow she would either win her freedom or die defending it. There were worse ways to go. The morning of the 4th day dawned gray and bitter cold. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind 2 feet of fresh snow and a world that looked clean and empty. But Cade knew empty was a lie. He'd been awake since before dawn, standing watch from the upstairs window with the sharps across his knees. The valley was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the deep silence that came before violence. "Anything?" Raina asked, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "Not yet." He took the coffee gratefully. "But they're out there, I can feel it." Raina moved to the other window, scanning the white expanse. The snow had erased all tracks, all evidence of movement. An army could be hiding in the tree line, and they wouldn't see it until too late. "How many you think he'll bring?" she asked. "All of them." Cade sipped the coffee, eyes never leaving the horizon. "Voss can't afford to fail twice. This time, he'll bring overwhelming force. 50 men, maybe more. Enough to crush us fast in public." "Then we're done." "Probably." He glanced at her. "You scared?" "Terrified," Raina admitted. "But I've been terrified before. It doesn't stop anything." Cade smiled at that. A real smile. Brief, but genuine. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They stood watch together as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning haze. Around 9 o'clock, Raina went down to check the ammunition caches while Cade maintained the vigil. That's when he saw the dust. Not from Black Ridge this time. From the west. Cade's hand tightened on the sharps as he counted riders. 8. No, 10. No, more than that, spread out in a loose formation that spoke of men who knew how to travel but not how to attack. Not professional guns. Something else. "Raina," he called down. "We've got company." She was on the stairs instantly, rifle in hand. "Voss?" "Don't think so. Wrong direction, wrong formation." He pointed. "There, coming from Copper Springs." They watched together as the riders approached, a ragged group of men on tired horses, carrying hunting rifles and wearing the weathered faces of frontier survivors. As they got closer, Cade could make out details. An older man built like a bull leading the group, a thin man coughing into his hand, a Mexican with gray in his beard and scars on his face. Ranchers. The group stopped 100 yards from the house, and the bull-like man raised one hand in a peaceful gesture. "Mrs. Mercer," he called. "Dutch Calloway from Copper Springs. We heard about your trouble with Voss. Wondered if you could use some extra rifles." Raina stared at them, speechless. Cade lowered the sharps slightly. "You know them." "Some of them," Raina said quietly. "Calloway lost his land to Voss 3 years ago. Brennan, the thin one, used to have a spread near Red Fork before the 555 ran him off. The others..." She trailed off. "These are men Voss destroyed. Why would they..." "That." "Because you gave them something they'd lost," Cade said. "Hope." Raina moved to the window, opened it, cold air rushing in. "Mr. Calloway," she called back. "You know what you're risking?" "Yes, ma'am," Dutch's voice carried clearly. "But we're done being afraid. If you're fighting, we're fighting with you." Raina looked at Cade, and he saw something shifting in her eyes. The loneliness cracking further, the isolation she'd built around herself for protection finally breaking under the weight of offered alliance. "Let them in," Cade said quietly. "We'll need every gun we can get." She nodded and went downstairs to open the gate. Within minutes, the ranch yard was full of men and horses. Not an army, not professional soldiers, just a collection of broken ranchers who decided that dying on their feet was better than living on their knees. Dutch Calloway dismounted heavily, approached Raina with his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said formally, "we heard you stood up to Voss. Heard you pulled a gun on him and lived to tell about it." "I did," Raina confirmed. "Then we figure you're either the bravest woman in Montana or the craziest." Dutch grinned, and years seemed to fall away from his weathered face. "Either way, we want to be here when he comes back." "He'll kill you," Raina said bluntly. "All of you. Voss doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." "Probably," Carl Brennan agreed, coughing. "But I'm dying anyway. Doctor says my lungs are shot. Gives me 6 months, maybe a year." He shrugged. "Rather spend that time fighting than waiting." James Ortiz stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "I fought in the range wars in New Mexico, Mrs. Mercer. Watched good men lose everything because evil men had more money and no conscience. When I heard what you did, what you're still doing, I thought maybe this time could be different." "Different how?" Raina asked. Different because someone's finally fighting back. Ortiz met her eyes. And if we stand with you, maybe others will too. Maybe the whole valley will remember what it means to choose courage over fear. Reina felt her throat tighten. For 4 years, she'd fought alone, convinced that strength meant needing nobody. But looking at these men, damaged, desperate, but still willing to fight, she realized that maybe true strength was accepting help when it was offered. "All right," she said. "If you're staying, here's what you need to know. Voss will come with professional guns. Men who've fought wars and won't hesitate to kill. We're outgunned, outnumbered, and probably outmatched. Our only advantage is that we're defending ground we know, and we're fighting for something that matters." "Sounds like my kind of odds," Dutch said. Cade stepped forward then, and the assembled men turned to look at him, this scarred stranger who'd appeared from nowhere and decided to fight for a cause that wasn't his. "If we're doing this," Cade said, his voice carrying authority that came from years of command, "we do it smart. No heroics. No wasted ammunition. We set up overlapping fields of fire, use the terrain, make every position defensible and every retreat planned. This isn't about glory, it's about survival." "Who are you?" one of the men asked, a younger rancher named Peters who'd lost his claim to forged documents. "Someone who's fought too many losing battles," Cade replied, "and learned a few things along the way." That seemed to satisfy them. They spent the next 2 hours organizing defenses, with Cade directing positions and Reina coordinating supplies. The men worked with the practiced efficiency of people who'd spent their lives doing hard labor in harsh conditions. They weren't soldiers, but they understood work, understood hardship, understood that survival required dedication. By noon, Iron Hollow Ranch had transformed from a lone woman's desperate stand into something resembling an actual defensive position. Not impregnable, nothing could be that, not with the numbers Voss would bring, but organized, purposeful, dangerous. Dutch Calloway approached Reina while she was distributing ammunition. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Mercer?" "Call me Reina, and yes. What happens if we actually win this?" Dutch looked around at the preparations, at the men digging firing pits in frozen ground. "If we somehow beat Voss, what then?" Reina paused, a box of cartridges in her hands. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've spent 4 years just trying to survive the next winter. Never thought past that." "Maybe you should start," Dutch said quietly, "because if we win, if we actually pull this off, it'll change everything. Not just for you or this ranch, but for every person in this territory who's been pushed around by men with money and guns." "That's a lot of weight for one fight." "It's the truth." He met her eyes. "You're not just defending your land anymore, Reina. You're giving people permission to fight back. And that's worth more than any ranch." Before Reina could respond, Cade's voice cut through the yard. "Movement on Black Ridge, everyone to positions." The transformation was instant. Men grabbed rifles and scattered to their assigned positions, some to the barn, some to the water tower, some to the firing pits Cade had designated. Within seconds, the yard was empty except for Reina and Cade standing on the porch. "How many?" Reina asked, raising the Winchester. Cade had the sharps leveled, peering through the crude sights. "Can't tell yet. Dust's too thick." He paused. "But it's a lot, more than last time." Reina's heart was hammering, but her hand stayed steady on the rifle. This was it, the moment she'd been preparing for, dreading, waiting for, the moment that would decide whether courage mattered or money always won. "Cade," she said quietly. "Yeah?" "Whatever happens, thank you." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his scarred face. "Save it for after," he said. "We're not dead yet." The riders came over the ridge in formation, not 16 this time, but 40 or more. They spread across the valley floor like a dark tide, professional and coordinated, moving with the precision of men who'd done this before. And at their center, mounted on his black stallion, rode Gideon Voss. He stopped his army 300 yards from the ranch, just outside effective rifle range, and surveyed the defenses. Reina could almost see him calculating, reassessing, recognizing that the lone widow he'd expected to break had somehow found allies. For a long moment, nothing moved. Two forces facing each other across frozen ground, waiting to see who would flinch first. Then Voss raised his hand, and his voice carried across the distance with the clarity of someone used to being obeyed. "Mrs. Mercer, I see you found some friends. That's good. More witnesses for when I burn this ranch to the ground. Raina stepped forward to the porch rail, rifle visible, but not raised. You want this land, Voss? She called back. Come and take it. Voss smiled. Raina could see it even from this distance. With pleasure, he said, and then all hell broke loose. The first shot came from Voss's line, a rifle crack that split the frozen air and sent a bullet whining past Raina's head, close enough that she felt the displacement. She dropped behind the porch rail as the world exploded into gunfire. 40 rifles opened up simultaneously, a wall of lead that chewed into the house's timber walls and shattered every window facing the valley. Wood splinters erupted around her, and Raina pressed herself flat against the porch boards, heart slamming against her ribs. This wasn't like the warning shots from 4 nights ago. This was execution. Return fire, Cade's voice cut through the chaos. Controlled shots. Make them count. The defenders answered, not with Voss's overwhelming volume, but with precise, deliberate shooting. Dutch Calloway fired from the barn loft, dropping one of Voss's riders from his saddle. James Ortiz sent 2 quick shots from behind the water trough, forcing 3 men to scatter for cover. Carl Brennan, despite his ruined lungs, worked his rifle with mechanical efficiency from the root cellar entrance. But they were still outgunned 5-1, and Voss's men knew their business. They're flanking south, someone yelled. Peters, the young rancher, his voice high with fear. Cade was already moving. He vaulted off the porch, sprinted across the open yard in a crouch, while bullets kicked up frozen dirt around his boots, and slid into position behind a water barrel near the barn. From there, he had a clear angle on the creek bed where a dozen of Voss's men were trying to use the dry channel for cover. The sharps boomed like thunder. One of the flanking men flew backward, chest erupting red. The others froze, suddenly realizing that their covered approach had been anticipated. Cade worked the rifle's action, loaded another round, fired again. Miss. The bullet spanged off a rock, but close enough that the men in the creek bed decided anywhere else was safer. They retreated in disorder, and Cade allowed himself one breath of satisfaction before bullets started hammering into the water barrel, punching through the wood and spraying him with splinters. Professional response. They'd identified him as a priority target. He rolled left, came up behind a feed trough, kept moving. First rule of guerrilla warfare: never stay static when the enemy knows where you are. Raina had made it inside the house and was upstairs now, the Winchester braced against the window frame. She sighted carefully on a man trying to advance using a dead horse for cover, led him slightly, squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked hard into her shoulder, and the man went down clutching his leg. Not a kill shot, but it took him out of the fight. She worked the lever action, chambered another round, found her next target. A man with a bandolier was directing fire from behind a cluster of rocks, probably one of Voss's lieutenants. Raina put her crosshairs on his center mass and fired. The shot went high, clipping the rock instead of flesh. She cursed, adjusted her aim, but the man had already ducked down, too smart to give her a second chance. Below her, she could hear glass shattering as Voss's men found the range on the lower windows. Something heavy thudded against the front door. They were shooting out the locks, trying to force entry. If they got inside while she was upstairs, she'd be trapped. Raina grabbed the ammunition bag and half ran, half slid down the stairs. She reached the landing just as the front door burst open, and 2 of Voss's men charged through, rifles raised. She didn't think, didn't aim, just pointed the Winchester from her hip and fired twice. The first man took the bullet in his shoulder and spun sideways, crashing into his partner. The second man tried to bring his rifle up, but Raina had already worked the lever and fired again. This time the shot caught him in the chest, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The wounded man was scrambling backward, dragging himself toward the door with one arm. Raina leveled the Winchester at his head. "Please," he gasped. "Please, She hesitated. 1 second, 2. And in that hesitation, gunfire from outside stitched across the doorframe, forcing her to dive for cover. When she looked again, the wounded man had dragged himself out onto the porch and disappeared. Raina's hands were shaking now, the Winchester suddenly heavy as iron. She'd just shot 2 men. One was definitely dead, bleeding out on her floor. The other might die from his wound, and she'd almost killed him in cold blood when he was begging for mercy. "No time for that," she told herself harply. "Move." She rolled away from the door, came up behind the overturned kitchen table she'd positioned there earlier, and started firing through the broken window at anything that moved. Outside, the battle had devolved into chaos. Voss's men were trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer volume of fire, but the ranch's defenders were making them pay for every yard gained. Dutch Calloway had turned the barn loft into a fortress, his hunting rifle booming steadily as he picked off anyone foolish enough to present a clear target. James Ortiz and two others were holding the stable, creating a crossfire that made approaching from the east a death sentence. But they were running out of ammunition, and Voss had plenty to spare. "We can't hold," Carl Brennan yelled from somewhere near the root cellar. "There's too many. Fall back to secondary positions," Cade shouted. He was behind the blacksmith's forge now, using the brick structure for cover while he reloaded the sharps with practiced speed. "Brennan, Ortiz, get to the house. Peters, cover them." The men moved in coordinated chaos, laying down suppressing fire while Brennan and Ortiz sprinted across the yard. Bullets chewed the ground around them, but somehow both men made it to the house intact. Voss's riders were getting bolder now, pressing closer, sensing weakness. A group of 5 men made a rush toward the barn, probably planning to torch it. Dutch Calloway shot 2 of them before they'd covered half the distance. The other 3 reached the barn wall and started dousing it with kerosene from cans they'd carried. Within seconds, flames were licking up the dry wood. "Barn's burning!" someone screamed. Dutch appeared at the loft opening, rifle in hand, and jumped. It was a 15-foot drop, and he hit hard, rolling awkwardly. He came up limping, one leg clearly injured, and started hobbling toward the house. A rifle cracked, and Dutch went down. "No!" Raina was moving before she thought about it, out the door, across the porch, into the open yard. Bullets snapped past her head, kicked up dirt at her feet, but she kept running until she reached Dutch's fallen body. He was alive. The bullet had caught him in the side below the ribs, and blood was spreading dark across his shirt. "Stupid," he gasped. "Stupid to come for me." "Shut up," Raina said. She grabbed him under the arms and started dragging him backward. He was heavy, dead weight, and every muscle in her body screamed protest. Bullets kept coming, one so close it tugged at her sleeve. Then Cade was there beside her, grabbing Dutch's other arm. "I've got him," Cade yelled. "Get back inside." They hauled Dutch across the yard together, bullets singing around them, and somehow made it to the porch. James Ortiz and Peters pulled Dutch inside while Cade and Raina collapsed against the wall, gasping. "That was stupid," Cade said. "I know. Could have got you killed." "I know." He looked at her, and despite everything, the gunfire, the blood, the burning barn, he smiled slightly. But it was brave. They didn't have time for more. Voss's men were regrouping, preparing for another push. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the gray sky, and the stable wasn't far behind. Thick smoke rolled across the ranch yard, providing cover for both sides but making it impossible to see clearly. Inside the house, Dutch Calloway was dying. Carl Brennan had torn the man's shirt open, revealing the bullet wound, an ugly hole that was leaking blood faster than Brennan could staunch it with torn cloth. "Lung shot," Brennan said quietly. He looked at Raina with eyes that had seen too much death. "He's got maybe an hour, maybe less." Dutch's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, his breathing wet and labored. "Did we—" He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Did we make 'em bleed?" "Yeah, Dutch," Raina said, kneeling beside him. "We made them bleed." "Good." His hand found hers, gripped weakly. "That's good. Wanted to matter. Before the end." "You matter," Raina said fiercely. "You came when nobody else would. You stood when everyone else ran. That matters." Dutch smiled, a real smile, peaceful. "Tell my boy," he whispered. "When you see him, tell him his old man died fighting." Then his eyes went distant, and the labored breathing stopped. Raina closed his eyes gently, her own vision blurring. Another death. Another person who'd tried to help her and paid for it with everything. "Mrs. Mercer!" Peters was at the window, his young face pale. "They're coming again! All of them!" Raina stood, wiped her eyes roughly, and picked up the Winchester. There would be time for grief later, if there was a later. "How many rounds left?" she asked Brennan. He checked quickly. "Maybe 60 total, split between all of us." "Not enough," Ortiz said grimly. "Never is," Cade replied. He was reloading the sharps, his movements mechanical. But we make them count anyway. Voss's final assault came with the smoke as cover. 30 men advancing in a coordinated line, using the burning buildings and thick haze to mask their approach. They'd learned from the earlier attacks. No more single rushes, no more exposed targets. This was professional military tactics, and it was working. The defenders fired from the house, but the smoke made aiming nearly impossible. Reyna put 3 shots into the gray wall and had no idea if any of them hit. Beside her, Peters was firing wildly, panic taking over. "Controlled shots!" Cade barked. "You're wasting ammunition." But it was hard to stay controlled when death was advancing through the smoke, and you could hear them coming but couldn't see them until they were almost on top of you. A figure materialized from the haze, one of Voss's men, rifle raised. Reyna fired, saw him drop, didn't wait to confirm the kill. "Keep shooting, keep moving, stay alive." The front door exploded inward, wood splintering as someone hit it with an axe. 3 men poured through the opening before Ortiz cut 2 of them down with a shotgun at close range. The 3rd man got off 1 shot that went wide before Cade put a bullet through his head from across the room. But more were coming, so many more. "Upstairs," Cade ordered. "Now, we can't hold this floor." They retreated in fighting chaos, Reyna covering while the others climbed the stairs, then Cade covering while she followed. They reached the 2nd floor just as Voss's men flooded the ground level. "Barricade the stairs!" Cade was already shoving a dresser toward the landing. Peters and Ortiz helped, piling furniture into a makeshift wall while Reyna covered the stairwell with the Winchester. A face appeared around the corner below, and she fired. The man fell backward with a scream. Another tried, met the same fate. After that, they stopped trying the direct approach. Instead, they started shooting through the floor. Bullets punched up through the boards randomly, deadly and unpredictable. One caught Peters in the foot, and he went down screaming. Ortiz dragged him away from the stairwell while Reyna and Brennan returned fire through the gaps in the barricade. This was it, the last stand. Trapped on the 2nd floor with maybe 20 rounds between them and an entire army below waiting for them to run out of ammunition or make a mistake. Cade moved to the window, looked out at the burning ranch. The barn was gone, collapsed into glowing embers. The stable was following. And in the yard below, he could see Gideon Voss sitting on his black stallion, watching the house burn with the patience of a man who knew he'd already won. "We need to break the siege," Cade said quietly. "How?" Reyna asked. "We're trapped up here." "Not trapped. Elevated." He turned to face her, and his eyes had that distant, calculating look she'd seen before. "You ever set a building on fire while you were still inside it?" Reyna stared at him. "That's insane." "It's survival." Cade moved to the center of the room, pointing. "There's a window on the north side, the one side they're not covering because they think we're pinned. If we start a fire downstairs, create enough smoke and chaos, we can drop from that window while they're trying to figure out what's happening." "And go where?" Ortiz demanded. "The whole ranch is surrounded." "The creek bed," Cade said. "The dry one they tried to flank from earlier. It runs 2 miles south before hitting the river. If we can reach it, we can use it for cover until we're clear." "That's running," Brennan said flatly. "We came here to fight." "And we fought," Cade replied. "But fighting doesn't mean dying stupid. We've bloodied Voss, shown the valley that resistance is possible. That's worth something, but it's not worth getting slaughtered when we've got no ammunition left and no chance of winning." Reyna looked around at the small group, Peters wounded and pale, Brennan coughing blood into his hand, Ortiz old and exhausted, and Cade, scarred and grim, proposing a plan that was probably suicide but better than the certainty of dying here. "What about Dutch?" she asked quietly. "We just leave him?" "Dutch is dead," Cade said, not unkindly. "And he died so we could live. Don't waste that." The words hit hard, but they were true. Dutch Calloway had come to Iron Hollow knowing he might die, hoping his death would mean something. If they all died here, that sacrifice meant nothing. "All right," Reyna said. "We run." They worked fast, using the last of their ammunition to keep Voss's men pinned downstairs while Cade prepared the fire. He smashed open the oil lamps, poured the fuel across the upstairs hallway, added anything else that would burn. When he was satisfied, he lit it and retreated to the north window. The fire caught instantly, spreading with hungry speed through the old timber. Within seconds, thick smoke was filling the 2nd floor, pouring down the stairs. Below, Reyna could hear confusion. Voss's men realizing something was wrong, not sure if it was deliberate or accident. "Window! Now!" Cade had it open, looking down at the 15-foot drop to the snow below. "Hang and drop. Roll when you hit." Peters went first, screaming when his wounded foot hit the ground. Brennan followed, landed hard, didn't get up immediately. Ortiz made it down cleanly despite his age. Then Reyna. She hung from the windowsill, the Winchester slung across her back, and let go. The fall seemed to last forever, and when she hit, the impact drove the air from her lungs and sent pain shooting up her legs. But nothing felt broken. Cade dropped last, landing beside her just as flames started showing through the upstairs windows. "Move!" he hissed. "Creek bed! Go!" They ran, stumbling, limping, exhausted, across the open ground toward the dry creek. Behind them, the house was fully engulfed now, flames reaching for the sky. Reyna heard shouting, realized some of Voss's men had spotted their escape. Bullets started kicking up snow around them. Ortiz went down, clutching his shoulder. Cade grabbed him, half carried, half dragged him the last 20 yards to the creek bed. They tumbled over the edge into the channel, landing in a heap in the frozen mud. For a moment, they just lay there, gasping. Then Reyna forced herself to look back at Iron Hollow Ranch. Everything was burning, the house, the barn, the stable, everything Thomas had built, everything she'd defended for 4 years, gone. Consumed by fire and smoke and Voss's determination to own what wasn't his, she felt tears on her face and didn't bother wiping them away. "I'm sorry," Cade said quietly beside her. "I know what you lost." "Everything," Reyna whispered. "I lost everything." "No." He gripped her shoulder. "You lost a building, but you're alive, and as long as you're alive, Voss hasn't won." Above them, on the ranch's edge, she could hear Voss's men searching, calling to each other. But the creek bed was deep, and the smoke was thick, and in the chaos, 5 people could disappear if they moved fast enough. "South," Cade said, helping Ortiz to his feet. "Stay low. Stay quiet. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they organize a real search." They moved like ghosts through the creek bed, following its winding path away from the burning ranch. Peters was crying from pain, Brennan coughing blood with every breath, Ortiz bleeding from his shoulder wound. None of them were in any shape to run, but they ran anyway. Because survival wasn't about being strong or fast or ready. It was about moving forward when everything in you wanted to collapse. It was about choosing life when death would be easier. It was what Reyna had been doing for 4 years, and she wasn't stopping now. They were 2 miles from Iron Hollow when they finally stopped to catch their breath. The creek bed had widened here, offering better cover, and Cade judged they'd put enough distance between themselves and Voss's men to risk a few minutes' rest. Peters collapsed immediately, his wounded foot swollen to twice its normal size. Brennan sat against the creek bank, his breathing so labored that every inhale sounded like tearing paper. Ortiz was the calmest, despite his shoulder wound. He'd been shot before, knew how to function through pain. Reyna stood apart from the others, looking back toward where Iron Hollow had been. She couldn't see the ranch anymore, but the smoke was visible, a dark column rising into the gray sky, marking the death of her home. Cade approached quietly, giving her space but making his presence known. "You all right?" he asked. "No," Reyna said honestly, "but I'm breathing, which is more than Dutch can say." He knew the risks. "Doesn't make it hurt less." Cade nodded, accepting that. "What now?" Reyna turned to face him, and Cade saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not defeat. She was too stubborn for defeat, but something harder, colder, determined. "Now we stop running," she said. "Now we make Voss regret every bullet he fired, every building he burned, every person he killed." "How? We've got no guns, no supplies, no ranch to defend." "But we've got proof," Reyna said. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope, water-stained, smoke-damaged, but intact. Thomas's original land claim, the legal deed he filed in 1881, signed and witnessed. "I grabbed it before we ran." She looked at the envelope. "Voss says our claim was illegal, says he's got documents proving it, but I've got the originals, and I'm writing to Helena to show them to every federal marshal, judge, and official who'll listen." "That's 3 days hard riding in winter," Cade said. "And Voss controls half the territory. You'd never make it." "Maybe not," Reyna agreed. "But I have to try. Because if I don't, if I just disappear into the frontier and let him win, then Dutch died for nothing. Thomas died for nothing. And Iron Hollow becomes just another ranch that Gideon Voss stole. She met Cade's eyes, and he saw the truth there. She'd already decided. This wasn't a discussion. It was a statement of intent. You're going to get yourself killed, he said quietly. Probably, Raina agreed. But at least I'll die trying. Cade looked at her for a long moment. This stubborn, damaged, impossibly brave woman who'd survived 4 winters alone and was now planning to ride into the lion's den with nothing but paperwork and spite. Then he smiled. All right, he said, then I'm coming with you. Cade, don't argue. You'll lose. He turned to the others. Brennan, can you ride? The thin man coughed, spat blood, nodded. For a while. Not far, but for a while. Ortiz? I'll manage, the Mexican said, pressing cloth against his shoulder wound. Peters? The young rancher looked at his ruined foot and shook his head. Can't walk, can't ride. I'm done. Then you hide, Cade said. Find a homestead, tell them your family, wait this out. The rest of us are riding for Helena. That's suicide, Peters said. Everything we've done in the past week has been suicide, Cade replied. At least this time we're choosing how we die. They left Peters hidden in an abandoned trapper's cabin 3 miles south, with instructions to find help once his foot healed. The young man didn't want to be left behind, but he couldn't argue with reality. A man with a shattered foot was dead weight on a winter ride through hostile territory. The rest of them, Raina, Cade, Brennan, and Ortiz, pushed south through the afternoon, following game trails and avoiding the main roads where Voss's men might be searching. They had no horses, no supplies, no weapons except the single revolver Cade had managed to keep hidden. But they had purpose. And sometimes, Raina thought, purpose was enough to keep you moving when your body wanted to quit. By nightfall, they'd covered maybe 10 miles. Not nearly enough distance to feel safe, but enough that the immediate pursuit had fallen behind. They made camp in a grove of pine trees, using fallen branches to create a crude shelter against the wind. Brennan's condition had worsened. His coughing was constant now, and every breath seemed to cost him something vital. Ortiz had fashioned a crude bandage for his shoulder, but the wound was still bleeding slowly, and infection was a real possibility. They were dying by degrees, and everyone knew it. Raina sat apart from the others, staring into the small fire they'd risked building. The flames reminded her of Iron Hollow burning, and the memory made her chest tight with grief and rage. You thinking about going back? Cade asked, settling beside her. Every minute, Raina admitted. Thinking about what I could have saved, what I should have grabbed. All those things Thomas built, all those memories, gone. Memories aren't in buildings, Cade said. They're in here. He tapped his head. Voss can burn every structure in Montana, but he can't touch what you remember. Doesn't feel that way. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I lost everything once. Different war, different reasons. But the feeling was the same. That emptiness where home used to be. How'd you survive it? Badly, Cade said honestly. Drank too much, fought too much, ran from anything that might matter, spent 20 years being half alive because being fully alive hurt too much. And now? He looked at her, firelight reflecting in his scarred face. Now I'm trying something different, he said. Trying to stand for something instead of running from everything. Don't know if it'll work, but it feels better than what I was doing. Raina felt something warm in her chest, not romance, not that simple, but connection, recognition. 2 damaged people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and decided that maybe damage didn't mean broken. Thank you, she said quietly, for staying, for fighting, for... She struggled to find words. For reminding me I'm not alone in this. Cade nodded slowly. You never were. You just needed to be reminded. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers while the Montana night grew colder and the stars came out overhead. Somewhere behind them, Gideon Voss was celebrating his victory, probably toasting the destruction of Iron Hollow Ranch with expensive whiskey and congratulations from men who feared him too much to tell him the truth. But ahead of them, 3 days hard riding through winter, Helena waited. and with it, the possibility that justice might actually exist outside the range of Voss's rifles. It was a thin hope. But for people who'd survived on nothing but stubbornness and spite for the past week, thin hope was enough. They buried Carl Brennan on the morning of the second day. His lungs had finally given out during the night. A wet, rattling death that came quietly while the others slept. Raina woke to find him cold and still, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been while living. The consumption that had been killing him for months had simply finished the job that Voss's bullets had started. There was no time for a proper burial. They scraped out a shallow grave in the frozen ground using broken branches and rocks, wrapped Brennan in his coat, and covered him with dirt and pine needles. Ortiz said a few words in Spanish that Raina didn't understand but felt anyway, and then they moved on because staying meant dying. Now they were three. Raina, Cade, and Ortiz pushed south through country that got rougher with every mile. The game trails had petered out, forcing them to navigate through dense pine forest and across frozen streams that soaked their boots and left their feet numb. Ortiz's shoulder wound had stopped bleeding but was showing signs of infection, red streaks radiating from the bullet hole, fever making his eyes glassy. He didn't complain, just kept walking with the grim determination of a man who'd survived worse and refused to quit now. They were maybe 40 miles from Helena when they found the horses. A small homestead sat in a valley between two ridges, not much more than a cabin and a barn, smoke rising from the chimney. 3 horses stood in a corral out back, looking well-fed and healthy despite the winter. "We need those horses," Cade said, crouched behind a fallen log where they'd stopped to observe. "That's stealing," Raina said. "It's borrowing with extreme prejudice." He looked at her. "We're 2 days from Helena on foot, maybe more with Ortiz slowing down. On horseback, we could make it in one hard ride. Maybe beat Voss's men there if they're not expecting us to move this fast." Raina knew he was right, but the thought of taking from people who were probably just trying to survive the same brutal frontier she'd been fighting against made her stomach turn. "What if they need those horses?" she asked. "What if we die before reaching Helena and Voss gets away with murder?" Cade countered. "I don't like it either, but we're past the point of clean choices." Ortiz settled the debate. "I'll pay them," he said, digging into his coat. He pulled out a small leather pouch, opened it to reveal maybe $20 in gold coins. Not enough for 3 horses, but enough that they're not being robbed. They're being bought from at a bad price during hard times. "You've been carrying that this whole time?" Raina asked. "Always keep something back," Ortiz said. "Learned that in the range wars. The man with no resources is the first to die." They approached the homestead carefully, hands visible, making no sudden moves. A woman appeared in the cabin doorway. Young, maybe mid-20s, with a rifle that looked too big for her thin frame. "That's close enough," she called. Her voice was steady, but Raina could see the fear underneath. Probably alone out here, probably terrified of strangers showing up unannounced. "Ma'am," Cade said, stopping 20 feet away, "we mean no harm. We need to buy 3 horses. We can pay. Those horses aren't for sale." "We'll give you $20, Ortiz said, holding up the pouch. "I know that's not fair value, but it's all we have." The woman's eyes flicked to the money, then back to them. Calculating. A homesteader alone in winter with $20 could buy supplies, could survive a failed crop season, could mean the difference between making it and starving. "Why you running?" she asked. "We're not running," Raina said, stepping forward. "We're riding to Helena to report a crime. Men burned my ranch, killed my friends. We need to reach the federal marshal before they cover their tracks." The woman studied Raina's face, the smoke damage on her clothes, the exhaustion in her eyes, the desperate honesty that was too raw to be a lie. "Voss?" she said quietly, not a question. Raina nodded. The woman lowered her rifle slightly. "He came through here 3 years back, offered my husband money for our land claim. When my husband refused, they found him dead a week later." "Accident," the sheriff said. "Kicked by a horse." Her voice was bitter. "Horse we didn't own." "I'm sorry," Raina said. "Sorry doesn't bring him back." The woman looked at the 3 of them, exhausted, wounded, barely standing. "But maybe stopping Voss does something." She walked to the corral, opened the gate. "Take the horses. Keep your money. You'll need it more than me." "Ma'am." "Just promise me something," the woman interrupted. "Promise me you'll make him pay. Not just with money or legal papers. Make him actually pay. Reyna met her eyes and saw the same grief, the same rage, the same desperate need for justice that had been driving her for the past week. "I promise," Reyna said. They rode hard that day, pushing the horses as fast as they dared through terrain that got progressively more treacherous. The animals were range horses, tough and sure-footed, but even they struggled with the steep climbs and icy streams. By late afternoon, Ortiz was swaying in his saddle, fever burning through him. The infection had spread despite Cade's attempts to clean and rebandage the wound. He needed a doctor, needed rest, needed things they couldn't provide in the middle of the Montana wilderness. "We have to stop," Reyna said, watching Ortiz nearly slide from his horse for the third time. "Stop and he dies anyway," Cade replied. "Helena's our only chance. They've got doctors there, supplies. If we can get him there tonight, he might make it. And if we push him and he dies on the trail, then at least he dies trying." Cade looked at her. "You think Ortiz wants to quit now? After everything?" Reyna didn't have an answer for that. She rode up beside Ortiz, steadied him when he started to slip again. "James," she said quietly, "can you make it?" Ortiz's eyes opened, glassy with fever but still aware. "How far?" "Maybe 20 miles. Maybe less if we're lucky." He smiled, a ghost of his earlier warmth. "I've ridden farther in worse shape. Keep moving." They kept moving. The sun was setting when they spotted the first signs of civilization, a trading post at a crossroads, smoke from distant homesteads, the rutted tracks of wagon roads that actually went somewhere. They were close now, maybe 10 miles from Helena, and Reyna felt something like hope stirring in her chest. Then they heard the horses behind them. Cade reined up, listening. Riders, multiple, coming fast. "Voss's men?" Reyna asked, though she already knew the answer. "Has to be. They must have figured out we were heading for Helena, sent men ahead to cut us off." He looked around quickly, calculating options. "There." He pointed to a narrow canyon cutting between two ridges. "We go through there. We might lose them in the rocks." "Or get trapped," Ortiz said, his voice weak. "Either way, it's better than getting run down in the open." Cade spurred his horse forward. "Move!" They rode into the canyon at a gallop, hooves echoing off stone walls that rose 50 feet on either side. It was a natural choke point, defensible if you had ammunition and time, a death trap if you had neither. The canyon twisted twice before opening into a small box valley, maybe 100 yards across. There was no way out except back the way they'd come. They were trapped. "Off the horses!" Cade was already dismounting, pulling the single revolver he'd managed to keep. "Find cover. When they come through that gap, we make them pay for every step." Reyna and Ortiz dismounted, taking positions behind boulders that lined the valley floor. Ortiz had a hunting knife, not much use against rifles, but better than nothing. Reyna had a rock, because that's all she had left. A rock and rage, and the certain knowledge that she'd come too far to die here, this close to Helena, this close to justice. The riders appeared at the canyon mouth moments later, 5 men, rifles drawn, scanning the valley. In the fading light, Reyna couldn't make out faces, but she recognized the formation, the professional way they moved. Voss's hired guns. The lead rider spotted them and raised his rifle. "Mrs. Mercer, Mr. Voss sends his regards, says you've caused him considerable inconvenience." "Tell Voss to come collect his regards himself," Reyna shouted back. "Can't do that, ma'am. He's busy celebrating the acquisition of your former property, but he did ask us to ensure you don't reach Helena alive." The rider's hand moved and Cade fired. The revolver's crack was sharp in the enclosed space, and the lead rider jerked backward, clutching his chest. He toppled from his horse, and the other 4 scattered for cover, returning fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around Reyna, whining into the twilight. She pressed herself flat against the boulder, heart hammering. 5 men with rifles against 3 people with 1 revolver and a knife. The math wasn't good. Cade fired twice more, conserving ammunition, forcing the riders to stay pinned behind their own cover. But he only had maybe 3 rounds left, and then they'd be defenseless. "We need a miracle," Ortiz said from his position. "Fresh out of those," Cade replied, reloading carefully. And then the miracle arrived. Not divine intervention, just Federal Marshal Wade Carrick and 6 armed deputies riding into the canyon behind Voss's men with rifles raised and badges gleaming in the dying light. "Federal Marshal," Carrick's voice boomed through the valley. "Drop your weapons! You're all under arrest for attempted murder!" For a moment, nobody moved. Voss's men were caught between two forces, outnumbered and outgunned. One of them, a scarred man with a bandolier, made the mistake of raising his rifle toward the marshals. 3 deputies fired simultaneously, and the scarred man went down. The other 3 dropped their weapons immediately, hands raised. It was over that fast. Carrick dismounted, walked past the surrendering men to where Reyna, Cade, and Ortiz stood behind their boulders. He was older than Reyna expected, 50-something, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be surprised by anything. "Mrs. Mercer?" he asked. "Yes," Reyna managed, her voice shaking with relief and exhaustion. "Got your telegram 3 days ago. Rode hard to reach Red Fork, but by the time I arrived, your ranch was ashes and you'd disappeared." He looked at the 3 of them, battered, wounded, barely standing. "Figured you'd either head for Helena or die trying. Glad to see it was the former." "How'd you find us?" Cade asked. "Tracked Voss's riders. They were moving fast toward Helena, which meant they were trying to intercept someone. Put 2 and 2 together." Carrick gestured to his deputies. "Get these prisoners secured. And someone help that man. He looks half dead." 2 deputies moved to support Ortiz, who'd finally allowed himself to collapse now that survival was guaranteed. They eased him to the ground, started examining his wound with professional efficiency. Carrick turned back to Reyna. "I'm going to need your full statement. Everything that happened, everyone involved, names, dates, evidence." Reyna pulled the envelope from her coat, the one she'd protected through fire, flight, and battle. Thomas's original land claim, smoke-damaged, but intact. "It started 4 years ago," she said, "when my husband disappeared during a blizzard, and it ends with Gideon Voss burning my ranch and killing anyone who tried to help me defend it." Carrick took the envelope, examined the documents carefully. His expression didn't change, but something cold moved through his eyes. "I've been trying to nail Voss for 10 years, he said quietly. "Every time I get close, witnesses disappear or evidence vanishes. He's got judges, sheriffs, politicians, half the territories in his pocket." He looked at Reyna. "But this? Original land claims, witnesses to arson and murder, his men caught attempting to kill you before you could testify. This might actually stick." "Might?" Reyna felt anger cut through her exhaustion. "He burned my home, killed my friends. How is that not enough?" "Because Voss has expensive lawyers and friends in Helena," Carrick said bluntly. "They'll argue self-defense, property disputes, anything to muddy the waters. We'll need more than documents and testimony. We'll need leverage." "What kind of leverage?" Carrick smiled, a hard, predatory expression. "The kind that makes powerful men very nervous. Come with me to Helena. Tell your story to every judge, official, and newspaper that'll listen. Make this public enough that Voss can't make it disappear quietly. And if he tries to kill me anyway? Then he does it in front of federal marshals and witnesses, which turns a territory dispute into a federal murder case." Carrick's smile widened. "Either way, we've got him." They rode into Helena just after midnight, a ragged group of survivors escorted by federal marshals and prisoners. The town was mostly dark, but lights still burned in the marshal's office and the territorial courthouse. Carrick led them straight to the courthouse, where a night clerk was persuaded to wake the territorial judge, a white-haired man named Ashford, who looked annoyed until Carrick explained the situation. Then the annoyance transformed into grim attention. "Gideon Voss," the judge repeated, sitting behind his desk in a nightshirt and robe. "You're accusing him of arson, murder, conspiracy, and land fraud?" "Among other things," Carrick said. He laid out the evidence. Thomas's land claim, witness statements from Reyna and the surviving ranchers, the captured men who'd attempted murder in a federal canyon. Judge Ashford studied the documents for a long time, occasionally glancing at Reyna with eyes that seemed to be measuring her credibility. "Mrs. Mercer," he said finally, "do you understand what you're asking? Voss has considerable influence. Challenging him publicly will make you a target for the rest of your life." "I'm already a target," Reyna said. "At least this way, I'm fighting back." The judge nodded slowly. "And you're prepared to testify? Under oath, in open court, against one of the most powerful men in Montana Territory?" "I am. Even knowing he'll do everything possible to discredit you, that his lawyers will call you a liar, a troublemaker, a hysterical woman who can't manage property." Reyna met his eyes. Let them try. Judge Ashford studied her for another moment, then turned to Carrick. Arrest Gideon Voss. Charge him with conspiracy to commit murder, arson, land fraud, and whatever else you can make stick. Do it publicly at noon tomorrow in Red Fork, where everyone can see. I want this to be a spectacle. You think public pressure will make a difference? Carrick asked. I think sunlight is the best disinfectant, the judge replied. Voss has operated in shadows for too long. Time to drag him into the light and see how well his empire holds up under scrutiny. They gave Raina a room in a boarding house near the courthouse. A small, clean space with a real bed and a door that locked. It was the first time in over a week she'd slept somewhere that wasn't frozen ground or a burning building. She should have been relieved, safe, ready to collapse. Instead, she sat by the window and stared at the dark streets of Helena, thinking about everything she'd lost and everything that still needed to be done. A knock at the door brought her back. She opened it to find Cade standing in the hallway, looking as exhausted as she felt. Can't sleep either, he asked. Too many ghosts, Raina said. She stepped aside, let him in. They sat together in silence for a while. Two people who'd survived impossible odds and still couldn't quite believe they were alive. Ortiz is going to make it, Cade said eventually. Doctor says the infection's bad, but they caught it in time. He'll be laid up for a few weeks, but he'll live. That's good. Yeah. Cade was quiet for a moment. What happens after the trial? Raina had been avoiding that question. After had seemed so distant, so unlikely, that planning for it felt like tempting fate. I don't know, she admitted. Iron Hollow's gone. Even if we win in court, even if Voss goes to prison, I've got no ranch to return to, no home. You could rebuild. With what? I've got nothing left, no money, no cattle, no... Her voice cracked slightly. Nothing. Cade reached over, took her hand carefully. His palm was scarred and rough, a working man's hand that had seen as much hardship as her own. You've got your life, he said quietly. That's not nothing. And you've got people who'll stand with you. Ortiz, the widow who gave us horses, the ranchers who rode to help you fight. Those connections matter. They matter, Raina agreed. But they don't rebuild barns or replace 4 years of work. No, Cade admitted. But they're a start. And starting over is better than giving up. Raina looked at him, this scarred stranger who'd chosen to fight beside her when he could have ridden past, who'd stayed when survival meant running, who'd become something more than an ally in the past terrible days. What about you? She asked. What happens to Cade Ashford after all this? He smiled slightly. Still figuring that out. Spent 20 years drifting, and now I'm not sure I remember how. Might be time to try staying put for once. Where? Wherever you end up, he said simply. If you'll have me. Raina felt tears sting her eyes. Not from grief this time, but from something warmer. Something that felt dangerously like hope. I'd like that, she whispered. They sat together through the night, watching Helena sleep, waiting for the dawn that would bring Gideon Voss's arrest and the beginning of justice that had been too long delayed. Marshal Carrick rode into Red Fork at noon the next day with a federal warrant and 6 armed deputies. The town square was crowded. Word had spread that something big was happening, and frontier towns lived for spectacle. Gideon Voss was in the Red Fork Saloon celebrating his victory over Iron Hollow Ranch with expensive whiskey and congratulations from men who still thought he was untouchable. He didn't see Carrick coming until the marshal was standing 3 feet away. Gideon Voss, Carrick said clearly, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, arson, land fraud, and intimidation of witnesses. You have the right to legal counsel. Anything you say can and will be used against you in territorial court. The saloon went silent. Voss looked at Carrick like he'd just told a particularly bad joke. You're joking. Do I look like I'm joking? Marshal, I don't know what lies you've been told, but I assure you... Save it for the judge, Carrick interrupted. He gestured to his deputies. Cuff him. Voss's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, not drawing, just a reflexive motion born from years of getting what he wanted through intimidation. 3 deputies had rifles pointed at his chest before his hand moved an inch. I wouldn't, Carrick said quietly. Voss's hand stopped. His face had gone pale, and for the first time in probably a decade, genuine fear crossed his features. "You're making a mistake," he said, but the certainty was gone from his voice. "I have friends, powerful friends. They'll watch you go to trial," Carrick said. "Because if they interfere, they'll be joining you." He nodded to his deputies. "Take him." They led Gideon Voss out of the saloon in handcuffs, past a crowd that had gathered to watch the most powerful man in Montana Territory get dragged through the street like a common criminal. Raina watched from the boarding house window across the street, Cade beside her. She didn't feel triumph, didn't feel vindication. She felt tired, hollow, like she'd been carrying a weight for so long that removing it left her empty. "It's not over," Cade said quietly. "Trial's in 3 weeks. His lawyers will fight every charge." "I know. And even if he's convicted, it won't bring back Dutch or Brennan or Thomas." "I know that too." Cade looked at her. "So why do you look disappointed?" Raina was quiet for a long moment, watching Voss disappear into the marshal's wagon. "Because I wanted him to fight," she said finally. "I wanted him to resist, to force a confrontation, to give me a reason to put a bullet through his heart, the way he destroyed everything I built." She paused. "But he just surrendered. Like all those years of terror and intimidation meant nothing when someone finally stood up to him." "That's the thing about bullies," Cade said. "They're only strong when people are afraid. Take away the fear, and they're just pathetic men pretending to be monsters." "Doesn't feel like enough." "It never does." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "But it's what we've got. And it's more than Voss gave any of his other victims." Raina nodded slowly, accepting the truth even if it didn't satisfy the rage still burning in her chest. Below, the crowd was dispersing, already gossiping about what they'd witnessed. By tomorrow, the story would spread across the territory. Gideon Voss arrested, the widow Mercer's impossible survival, the beginning of accountability for crimes everyone knew about, but nobody dared challenge. It wasn't everything Raina had wanted. But maybe Cade was right. Maybe it was enough. The trial lasted 6 days, and the entire territory watched. Judge Ashford ran his courtroom with an iron fist, refusing to let Voss's expensive lawyers from Chicago turn the proceedings into a circus. Every objection was carefully considered, every witness questioned thoroughly, every piece of evidence examined under scrutiny that left no room for manipulation. Raina testified on the 3rd day. She walked to the witness stand wearing a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit, her hands still scarred from fence work and her face carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd survived too much, too fast. Voss's lead lawyer, a slick man named Hendricks who wore suits that cost more than most Montana families made in a year, circled her like a predator. "Mrs. Mercer," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it true that your ranch was failing, that you were deeply in debt and facing foreclosure?" "We had hard winters," Raina admitted, "but we weren't failing." "Yet you had no ranch hands, no income, mounting debts with the bank. Sounds like failure to me." "Sounds like survival," Raina corrected. "Which is different." Hendricks smiled, sensing weakness. "And isn't it true that my client made you a generous offer to purchase your property? $20,000, I believe?" "He did." "But you refused this generous offer even though you desperately needed the money?" "I refused because the ranch wasn't for sale," Raina said, "and because his offer came with 16 armed men and threats to burn me out if I didn't sign." "Alleged threats," Hendricks said smoothly. "Do you have proof beyond your word?" "I have witnesses, the men he sent to kill me, the ranchers who came to help defend my land." Raina leaned forward. "And I have the fact that my ranch is now ash because your client decided that if he couldn't buy what he wanted, he'd destroy it." "Objection," Hendricks said. "Speculation." "Sustained," Judge Ashford replied. But his eyes were on Raina with something that looked like approval. The questioning continued for 2 hours, with Hendricks trying every angle to paint Raina as a hysterical woman who couldn't manage property, who'd invited violence through her own stubbornness, who was now trying to profit from tragedy by blaming an innocent businessman. But Raina had spent 4 years surviving Montana winters alone. She'd faced down blizzards, grizzlies, and men with guns. One lawyer in an expensive suit didn't scare her. "Mr. Hendricks," she said when he was finally winding down, "you can call me stubborn, hysterical, whatever makes you sleep at night. But the truth is simple. Your client wanted my land, I refused to sell, and he tried to kill me for it. Everything else is just words." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Ashford's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order," he said. Then, to Hendricks, "Are you finished with this witness?" Hendricks looked at Raina with barely concealed frustration. Yes, Your Honor. Good. Mrs. Mercer, you may step down. Raina walked back to her seat beside Cade, her legs shaking but her head high. He squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture of support that carried more weight than words. You did good, he whispered. Doesn't feel like it. It will. The prosecution's case was built carefully over the next 3 days. Marshal Carrick testified about the pattern of intimidation and violence that followed Voss wherever he acquired land. The widow from the homestead rode 2 days to testify about her husband's suspicious death after refusing to sell. James Ortiz, still weak from his shoulder wound but determined, described the siege of Iron Hollow Ranch in detail that left the jury pale. And then the prosecution called their final witness, Sheriff Mallory of Red Fork. Mallory walked to the stand like a man approaching his own execution. He'd been subpoenaed, forced to testify under oath, and everyone in the courtroom knew what was coming. Sheriff Mallory, the prosecutor began, how long have you served as sheriff of Red Fork? 6 years, Mallory said quietly. And during that time, how many complaints were filed regarding Gideon Voss or the Triple V Syndicate? Mallory's hands clenched. I'd have to check my records. I'll help refresh your memory. 23 complaints, ranging from intimidation to arson to suspected murder. How many of those complaints resulted in arrests? Silence. Sheriff Mallory, I asked you a question. None, Mallory said finally. None. 23 complaints, and you made exactly 0 arrests. The prosecutor let that hang in the air. Why? Insufficient evidence. Really? Or was it because Mr. Voss paid you to ignore those complaints? Objection! Hendricks was on his feet. Speculation and slander. Your Honor, I have bank records showing monthly deposits to Sheriff Mallory's account from Triple V Syndicate sources, the prosecutor said, pulling out documents. Unless the sheriff has another explanation for these payments? Mallory looked at Voss, then at the judge, then down at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I took money, he said. Voss paid me to look the other way, to file reports and forget them, to make sure complaints disappeared before they reached federal attention. He looked up, and his face was haggard. I knew what he was doing. I knew people were getting hurt. But I was scared. Scared of losing my job. Scared of what he'd do if I didn't cooperate. Scared of... He stopped, unable to continue. No further questions, the prosecutor said quietly. The defense tried to rebuild their case, calling character witnesses who swore Voss was a pillar of the community, business associates who insisted all his dealings were legitimate, surveyors who claimed Iron Hollow's land claim had irregularities that justified Voss's actions. But the damage was done. The pattern was too clear, the corruption too obvious, the evidence too overwhelming. On the 6th day, Judge Ashford gave his jury instructions and sent them to deliberate. They were back in 40 minutes. Raina stood as the foreman read the verdict, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone could hear it. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. Voss's face went white. On the charge of arson, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom was completely silent. On the charge of land fraud and intimidation, we find the defendant guilty. 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 Every charge, every crime, every sin that Gideon Voss had committed in his climb to power, laid bare and judged. Judge Ashford's gavel fell. Mr. Voss, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in the territorial prison. Your assets are to be seized and distributed as restitution to your victims. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted, people cheering, crying, shouting, years of fear and anger finally finding release. Raina stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. They'd won. Actually won. Justice, real, tangible justice, had been served. She felt Cade's arm around her shoulders, steadying her. It's over, he said quietly. Yeah, Raina whispered. It's over. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. Not really. Voss might be going to prison, but the scars he'd left wouldn't heal overnight. The valley would take years to recover from his reign of terror, and some wounds, like the deaths of Dutch and Brennan and Thomas, would never fully close. Justice wasn't closure. It was just the beginning of healing. The weeks following the trial moved in a strange blur. Voss's assets were indeed seized. The territorial government moved quickly, probably terrified that his Chicago lawyers would find some loophole. The Triple Vi syndicate was broken up and sold, with proceeds going to victims of Voss's various schemes. Rayna received $15,000 in restitution, not enough to make up for 4 years of hell, but enough to rebuild, enough to start over. The question was, start over where? Iron Hollow Ranch was ashes. Even if she wanted to rebuild on that land, it would take years and resources she didn't have. And the memories there, Thomas's death, the siege, the burning, made the idea of returning feel less like homecoming and more like living in a graveyard. She was staying in Helena, trying to figure out her next move, when James Ortiz found her at the boarding house. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, hat in hands. "Got a minute?" "Of course. How's your shoulder?" "Healing slow, but healing." He shifted awkwardly. "I wanted to talk to you about something, about the valley." Rayna gestured for him to sit, poured coffee from the pot she kept warming on the stove. "What about the valley?" she asked. "Word spreading about what you did, about standing up to Voss, about the trial, about proving that fighting back was possible." Ortiz took a sip of coffee. "People are talking. Ranchers who lost land are filing claims to get it back. Families who disappeared are returning. The whole territory is changing." "That's good." "It is. But they need leadership. Someone who understands what they went through, who can help organize the recovery." He looked at her directly. "They're asking for you, Rayna." "Me?" She laughed, surprised. "I'm nobody, just a widow who got stubborn at the wrong time." "You're the woman who refused to kneel when everyone else did," Ortiz corrected. "That makes you somebody, and the valley needs that right now." Rayna was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee. "I don't know if I have that in me anymore, James," she said honestly. "I'm tired. Tired of fighting, tired of being strong, tired of carrying weight I never asked for." "I understand that," Ortiz said. "But consider this. You spent 4 years defending one ranch alone. Imagine what you could do helping dozens of families rebuild together, not as someone fighting against, but as someone building towards something better." "Like what?" "Like a valley where people don't live in fear, where the law actually matters, where strength comes from community instead of isolation." He smiled. "You showed us that was possible. Now help us make it real." The proposal sat heavy in Rayna's mind for days. Part of her wanted to take the restitution money and disappear, move to California or Oregon, somewhere Voss's shadow didn't reach, somewhere she could finally rest. But another part, the stubborn part that had kept her alive through 4 brutal winters, knew that running now would make everything she'd survived meaningless. Dutch Calloway had died believing his sacrifice mattered. Carl Brennan had ridden to his death hoping to change something. Thomas had built Iron Hollow believing that ordinary people could carve out something worth defending. If she walked away now, what did those deaths mean? She was still wrestling with the decision when Cade found her walking along Helena's main street, watching the town wake up to another Montana morning. "Heard Ortiz made you an offer," he said, falling into step beside her. "Word travels fast." "Small town. Smaller when everyone's talking about the same thing." He glanced at her. "You gonna take it?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to. Part of me just wants to disappear and never think about any of this again." Both are fair choices. They walked in silence for a while, their breath misting in the cold morning air. "Can I tell you something?" Cade asked eventually. "Always." "I spent 20 years disappearing, running from anything that hurt, avoiding anything that might matter, convincing myself that survival meant staying unattached." He stopped, turned to face her. "And you know what all that running got me? A scarred face, a lifetime of regrets, and the certainty that I'd die alone with nothing to show for all those years but worn boots and an empty saddlebag." "That's pretty grim." "It's the truth." He paused. "But these past weeks, fighting beside you, standing for something that actually mattered, being part of something bigger than just staying alive. That's the first time in 2 decades I felt like my life meant anything." Rayna felt her throat tighten. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that running feels safe, but it's lonely. And building something, even when it's hard, even when you're tired, that's what makes life worth living." He took her hand carefully. "You asked me what happens to Cade Ashford after all this. The truth is, I'm hoping Cade Ashford stays in Montana, helps rebuild a valley that finally has a chance at something better, and maybe builds a life with a stubborn woman who taught him that courage matters more than comfort. Raina stared at him, processing what he'd just said. It wasn't a proposal, not exactly, but it was an offer of partnership, of shared purpose, of choosing together instead of surviving alone. "You really want to stay?" she asked. "Help rebuild, deal with land claims and community organizing and all the boring, exhausting work that nobody celebrates?" "Yeah," Cade said simply. "I do." Raina looked at him, this scarred stranger who'd become her partner, her defender, her friend, who'd chosen to stand when running was easier, who'd survived hell beside her and was now offering to help build something from the ashes. And she realized that maybe she'd been asking the wrong question all along. It wasn't about whether she had the strength to lead the valley's recovery. It was about whether she had the courage to try, whether she could transform the stubbornness that had kept her alive into the determination to build something better. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's do it." Cade smiled, that rare, genuine smile that made years fall away from his scarred face. "Yeah? Yeah." Raina squeezed his hand. "Let's go rebuild a valley." They returned to Red Fork 2 weeks later, and the town that had once whispered about the widow Mercer now spoke her name with something close to reverence. The saloon where Voss had been arrested was under new management. The sheriff's office had a new sheriff, a former deputy from Helena who actually believed in enforcing the law. And the ranchers who'd been pushed out were slowly returning, filing claims, rebuilding what Voss had destroyed. Raina and Cade bought land 20 miles south of where Iron Hollow had stood. Cheaper property, less isolated, close enough to Red Fork for community, but far enough for privacy. It wasn't the same as what she'd lost, but maybe that was good. Starting over on the same ground would have meant living with ghosts. This was different. This was choosing forward instead of backward. They built a house together. Nothing fancy, just timber and stone and sweat. Cade handled the heavy construction while Raina designed the layout, making sure every window faced open ground, every door had good sight lines, every approach was visible. They'd both learned that safety came from preparation, and neither of them would ever trust blindly again. But they could trust each other. James Ortiz recovered enough to reclaim his original land, the spread he'd lost to Voss's legal manipulations 3 years earlier. He found it overgrown and neglected, but the bones were still good. He hired on help, started rebuilding, and within 6 months had cattle grazing on land he'd thought was lost forever. The widow who'd given them horses showed up one day with a wagon full of supplies and a quiet determination to help. She and Raina became friends, the kind of friendship forged by shared grief and shared survival. They organized a valley-wide meeting, bringing together everyone who'd been victimized by Voss's reign, helping them navigate the legal process of reclaiming stolen land and filing for restitution. It was hard, exhausting work. Some claims were clear-cut, others tangled in years of forged documents and corrupt rulings. Some families had given up hope and moved on, unwilling to return even when their land was restored. Others came back with vengeance, determined to rebuild bigger and better than before. But slowly, painfully slowly, the valley began to heal. One evening, 6 months after the trial, Raina stood on her new porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The house was finished, cattle were grazing in the south pasture, and for the first time in years she felt something close to peace. Cade came out carrying 2 cups of coffee, handed her one. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Dutch," Raina said, "and Brennan, wondering if they'd be proud of what we're building." "I think they would be." "Yeah? They didn't die for revenge," Cade said. "They died believing that standing up mattered more than staying safe. This valley, people reclaiming their land, families returning, community instead of fear, that's what they wanted." Raina nodded slowly, sipping her coffee. "I still miss them. Miss Thomas, too. Miss the certainty that I had before everything fell apart." "You want that certainty back?" "Sometimes." She looked at him. "But I think I'm starting to understand something Thomas used to say. He'd tell me that the frontier wasn't about having easy answers. It was about making hard choices and living with them." "Smart man." "Yeah, he was." Raina smiled slightly. "He'd like you, I think. Appreciate the way you showed up when running was easier. Think he'd mind you rebuilding with someone new?" "No," Raina said honestly. Thomas wasn't petty like that. He'd want me to be happy, to build something worth defending. She paused. I think he'd be glad I found someone who understands that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about accepting it when it's offered. Cade set down his coffee, took her hand carefully. Raina Mercer, I'm going to ask you something, and you can say no without it changing anything between us. All right. Would you consider marrying me? Not because you need protection or because I'm trying to claim what's yours, but because building a life together sounds better than building parallel lives that happen to be close. Raina looked at him, really looked at him, at the scars that told stories he'd slowly been sharing, at the hands that had defended her ranch and helped build her new house, at the eyes that had seen too much violence but still chose gentleness when it mattered. This wasn't like her marriage to Thomas, young and passionate and certain. This was different, harder earned, built on shared survival and mutual respect and the understanding that damage didn't mean broken. Yes, she said quietly. I'll marry you. Cade smiled, that full, genuine smile she'd only seen a handful of times. Yeah? Yeah, she squeezed his hand. Let's build something worth defending together. They married in Red Fork's small church 6 weeks later. The ceremony was simple. Judge Ashford presiding, James Ortiz standing up as witness, half the valley crowded into pews because the widow who'd defeated Gideon Voss was now becoming Raina Ashford. The widow from the homestead cried through the whole ceremony, and nobody minded because half the congregation was crying too. It wasn't tears of sadness. It was relief. Hope. The recognition that after years of fear and violence, something good was finally happening. The reception was held in the newly rebuilt Red Fork Saloon, and it turned into an impromptu celebration of everything the valley had survived. Ranchers who'd reclaimed their land brought whiskey and stories. Families who'd returned brought food and music. And Raina, who'd spent 4 years isolated by grief and stubbornness, found herself surrounded by community she hadn't realized she'd been building. Late in the evening, after too much whiskey and dancing, she stepped outside for air. The Montana night was clear and cold, stars blazing overhead like scattered diamonds. Marshal Carrick found her there, smoking a cigar and looking pleased with himself. Mrs. Ashford, he said, tipping his hat. Congratulations. Thank you, Marshal, and thank you for… Raina gestured vaguely. Everything. Without your help, Voss would still be… Don't thank me, Carrick interrupted. You're the one who stood up. I just made sure the law did its job. He paused. But I wanted to tell you something about Thomas. Raina went still. What about him? After the trial, I went through Voss's confiscated papers, found some interesting things, including reports from his men about scouting your ranch in the winter of 1883. Carrick pulled out a folded document. One of those reports mentioned encountering a rancher who'd discovered their operation, a man named Thomas Mercer. Raina's breath caught. You're saying… I'm saying your husband didn't die in a blizzard, Carrick said quietly. He was murdered. Probably because he'd seen too much and Voss couldn't risk him reporting it. He handed her the document. I can't prove it in court. Too much time has passed, and the men involved are either dead or scattered. But I thought you should know the truth. Raina took the paper with shaking hands. Reading it confirmed what she'd suspected for 4 years but couldn't prove. Thomas hadn't been killed by weather or accident. He'd been murdered by the same man who'd later tried to steal everything he'd built. Thank you, she whispered. Carrick nodded. Justice isn't always about convictions, Mrs. Ashford. Sometimes it's just about knowing the truth. He tipped his hat again. Enjoy your wedding night. Raina stood alone in the darkness, holding the document that finally answered years of questions. She should have felt rage, should have felt the need for revenge beyond Voss's prison sentence, but all she felt was tired relief. Thomas's death hadn't been her fault, hadn't been preventable. He'd died trying to protect what they'd built, and Voss had paid for that crime even if he was never specifically charged with it. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was enough. She folded the document carefully, tucked it in her coat, and walked back into the saloon where her new husband was laughing with James Ortiz and her community was celebrating survival. The past would always carry weight, but the future was still being built, and for the first time in 4 years, Raina Ashford was ready to build it. 10 years later, the valley had transformed completely. The Triple Voss Syndicate was a distant memory, replaced by a network of independent ranches run by families who'd learned that cooperation was stronger than competition. Red Fork had grown into a proper town with a school, a bank run by honest people, and a sheriff who actually enforced the law. And on a ranch 20 miles south, a spread that had grown from modest beginnings into one of the valley's most productive. Raina and Kate Ashford watched their two daughters chase chickens through the yard while their youngest son napped on the porch. "You ever think about Iron Hollow?" Kate asked, sitting beside her on the steps. "Sometimes," Raina admitted, "but less as time goes on. It was part of my life, but it's not my whole life." "You miss it?" "I miss Thomas. Miss the certainty I had before everything fell apart, but I don't miss the isolation. Don't miss surviving alone." She looked at him. "This, us, the kids, the community we've built, this is better." Cade smiled, and the scars on his face had softened over the years, worry lines replaced by laugh lines. "Better than I deserved," he said. "Better than either of us deserved," Raina corrected. "But we'll take it anyway." Their oldest daughter, named Sarah after the widow who'd given them horses, came running up with a chicken feather in her hand. "Mama, look what I found!" "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Raina said, admiring the feather with appropriate seriousness. Sarah ran off again, and Raina watched her go with something close to contentment. She'd learned something important over the past decade. Survival wasn't about enduring alone. It was about accepting help, building community, and understanding that strength came from connection rather than isolation. Iron Hollow Ranch had been built by two people fighting against the frontier. This new ranch, this new life, was built with others. With neighbors who helped during hard winters. With friends who shared resources during drought. With a community that understood the difference between taking and building. Gideon Voss had tried to create an empire through fear and violence. He'd accumulated land and power and money, and all of it had crumbled the moment someone stood up to him. But what Raina had built, what the entire valley had built together, that would last. Because it wasn't built on fear. It was built on shared struggle, mutual respect, and the understanding that real strength came from lifting others up rather than pushing them down. That evening, after the children were asleep, Raina stood on her porch one last time, looking out at the land she and Cade had turned from empty ground into a working ranch. The mountains rose dark against the stars, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. It was the same Montana wilderness that had nearly killed her a decade ago. The same brutal frontier that took more than it gave, that crushed dreams as often as it fulfilled them. But she wasn't the same woman who'd stood alone on a burning ranch, refusing to surrender. She'd learned that courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about choosing to fight even when fear made sense. That justice wasn't a guarantee, but something you had to demand and defend. That community wasn't weakness, it was survival. And most importantly, she'd learned that the frontier didn't make you strong. Your response to it did. Cade came out and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Coming to bed?" "In a minute," Raina said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how far we've come. About the people who didn't make it. About whether any of this would have happened if I'd just sold when Voss first made his offer." "You'd have regretted it," Cade said. "Spent the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you'd stood your ground." "Maybe. But at least Dutch and Brennan would still be alive. Maybe. Or maybe they'd have died alone and forgotten instead of dying for something that actually mattered." He squeezed her shoulder. "You can't carry their deaths forever, Raina. At some point you have to let them rest." She knew he was right. But letting go meant accepting that good people had died so she could live, and that weight never fully lifted. "I just want to make sure it meant something," she said quietly, "that their sacrifice actually changed things." "Look around," Cade said, gesturing at the valley, at the scattered lights from neighboring ranches, at the community they'd built together. "Does this look like nothing changed?" Raina looked, and despite the grief and guilt she still carried, she had to admit the valley had changed. Was still changing. Families who'd been terrorized were now thriving. Land that had been stolen was being worked by people who actually owned it. And fear, the currency Voss had traded in, had been replaced by something stronger. Hope, not naive hope. Not the kind that believed everything would be easy, but the hard-earned hope that came from surviving impossible odds and building something better from the ashes. "No," she said finally. It doesn't look like nothing changed. Then let it be enough, Cade said gently. Dutch and Brennan and Thomas. They'd want you to live, not just survive. To build, not just defend. To be happy instead of just being strong. Raina leaned into him, accepting the truth of his words, even though it hurt to let go. All right, she whispered. I'll try. They stood together in the Montana darkness, two scarred survivors who'd chosen to build instead of run, to connect instead of isolate, to believe that one person's refusal to kneel could actually change the world. The frontier would always be brutal, would always take more than it gave, would always demand strength that most people didn't know they had. But Raina Ashford had learned something that Gideon Voss never understood. Real power didn't come from owning everything. It came from building something worth defending, from standing with others instead of standing over them, from choosing courage when fear made more sense. And in the end, that was the lesson the Valley had learned, not from courtrooms or trials or legal documents, but from one stubborn woman who'd refused to surrender and showed everyone watching that resistance was possible, that fighting back mattered, that one person's courage could inspire an entire community to stand up. And that was worth everything she'd lost along the way.